Lula Ferguson smiled beside her husband at the charity dinner while everyone praised Isaac Whitmore as the perfect man. Then she saw Brooke Langley across the room, laughing softly, wearing the bracelet Lula had bought Isaac for their anniversary. Lula's hand tightened around her glass. She had known about the affair since month 3. She had known about the hotel rooms, the secret apartment, the lies, the money. And for 2 years, she said nothing. Not because she was weak, because she was building something. And by the time Isaac realized, his quiet wife had been watching everything, he had already stepped into the trap she made for him. If you've ever seen kindness mistaken for weakness, stay with Lula's story and tell me in the comments what you would have done. The first time Lula Ferguson thought something was wrong, Isaac Whitmore kissed her forehead before leaving for work. It was such a small thing, so ordinary. But his lips barely touched her skin. No warmth, no pause, no instinct to linger. Just contact. Like checking something off a list. At the time, Lula stood in their enormous white kitchen, with a cup of coffee, growing cold in her hands, watching the taillights of Isaac's Mercedes disappear through the gates of their wealthy, suburban neighborhood outside Chicago. She remembered thinking maybe he was stressed. Maybe the pressure at work was getting worse. Maybe marriage simply changed after 7 years. That was what women told themselves when they loved too deeply. Lula had spent most of her marriage making excuses for Isaac. He worked hard. He carried pressure. He provided. He was ambitious. And ambitious men, according to Isaac, required understanding wives. At 34, Lula looked like the kind of woman magazines called effortlessly elegant. Soft brown hair, calm eyes, graceful posture. The kind of beauty that didn't scream for attention. But what most people noticed first about Lula wasn't beauty. It was kindness. She listened carefully when people spoke, remembered birthdays, sent handwritten sympathy cards, volunteered at hospital fundraisers long before she married Isaac. Before becoming Mrs. Whitmore, Lula had been the development director for a children's hospital foundation. She loved the work, the long nights, the emotional stories, the feeling that her efforts mattered. Then Isaac's career exploded. Corporate consulting, executive networking, private investor dinners. A rising golden boy in Chicago's business world. And slowly, Lula's life became organized around Isaac's success. His dinners, his clients, his appearances, his schedule, his image. At first, she didn't mind sacrificing. That was what love was, wasn't it? Building together, supporting each other. But somewhere along the way, support became disappearance. Isaac stopped asking about her dreams because he assumed they no longer existed. And maybe for a while, they didn't. The signs began subtly, too subtly. Late meetings became overnight conferences. Overnight conferences became weekends away. His phone started living face down on every surface. His smile became delayed when she walked into rooms. His compliments became observations. You look nice. Not, you're beautiful. There was always distance now. Invisible. But sharp enough to cut her open anyway. One rainy Thursday night, Lula waited nearly midnight before Isaac finally came home. She heard the garage open, then close. A minute later, the front door unlocked. Isaac entered wearing exhaustion like a performance. Long day, he muttered, tossing his keys into a marble bowl. Lula looked up from the couch. You missed dinner. I told you I had meetings. You said dinner with clients, which was a meeting. His tone already carried irritation. Like her question itself was unfair. Lula swallowed quietly. I made your favorite. Isaac loosened his tie with one hand. Lula, I'm tired. Can we not do this? Do what, be disappointed, need affection, exist? She almost asked.
Instead, she smiled weakly. Of course. That night, he fell asleep with his back toward her. Lula stared at the ceiling for hours. Something inside her whispered that she was losing him, but she still didn't imagine another woman. Not yet. 3 weeks later, she found the receipt. It happened accidentally. Isaac asked her to drop off one of his navy suits at the dry cleaner before a conference in Chicago. Lula checked the pockets first out of habit. Inside the inner pocket was a folded hotel invoice from the Langford Hotel downtown. 2 guests. Champagne service. Late checkout. Her stomach tightened immediately. Isaac had told her he stayed at the office that night after a strategy session. Lula sat on the edge of their bed, staring at the paper so long her fingers began trembling. No, there had to be another explanation. Corporate hospitality, client entertainment, wrong jacket, wrong receipt, wrong everything. Because the alternative felt impossible. That evening she searched for reasons to believe him. But once suspicion entered a marriage, it spread like spilled ink. Every memory became contaminated. Every late text. Every cancelled dinner. Every distracted expression. Lula started noticing things she had ignored before. Charges from restaurants they had never visited together. A florist purchase from a boutique downtown. An unfamiliar perfume lingering faintly on one of Isaac's scarves. And then there was the calendar notification. It appeared briefly on Isaac's phone one morning while he showered beside their bedroom. Be Thursday. Same place. Lula froze. Her heart pounded so hard she thought she might faint. She hated herself for looking, but she hated herself even more for still hoping she was wrong. The affair revealed itself fully 2 weeks later. Isaac told her he was attending a private executive dinner in Chicago and would probably stay overnight. Lula nodded calmly. Then she followed him. Rain fell across the city in silver streaks as she parked half a block from the Langford Hotel. She told herself she only wanted certainty. Nothing more, nothing less. Her hands shook against the steering wheel as she watched executives and wealthy couples enter through the glowing glass entrance. Then Isaac appeared. And he wasn't alone. Brooke Langley walked beside him, wearing a fitted black coat and heels Lula recognized from Isaac's company holiday party. Young, beautiful, polished. The kind of woman people described as going places. Isaac touched Brooke's lower back gently as they entered the hotel. A gesture so natural, it destroyed something inside Lula instantly. She sat frozen in the car for nearly 10 minutes before finally forcing herself to move. Inside the hotel lobby, soft piano music drifted through the air. Lula stood partially hidden near the bar entrance. And there they were. Isaac leaned toward Brooke, laughing quietly, not politely, not professionally, intimately. His face looked lighter with Brooke, freer, like the version of him Lula hadn't seen in years. Then Brooke reached across the table and adjusted Isaac's tie affectionately. The same tie Lula had bought him for Christmas. Lula stopped breathing for a second. Pain rushed through her body so violently she thought she might collapse right there onto the marble floor. She expected anger, screaming, some dramatic confrontation. But what came instead was silence. Cold, devastating silence. Because suddenly, Lula understood something terrifying. If she confronted Isaac now, he would deny everything. He would delete messages, move money, rewrite the story. And somehow, she would become the emotional wife who imagined problems. Isaac was too careful, too polished, too practiced. So Lula turned around and walked out of the hotel without making a sound. Rain soaked through her coat immediately. She barely noticed. By the time she returned home, it was after midnight. Isaac arrived 40 minutes later, carrying the scent of expensive whiskey and another woman's perfume. He smiled tiredly when he saw her awake in the kitchen. "You're still up,"
Lula looked at him across the counter, at the man she had built her entire adult life around, the man currently lying to her face without hesitation. And somehow, the worst part wasn't the affair. It was how easy it seemed for him. Isaac loosened his cufflinks casually.
Actually, he said, pouring himself water, there's something I wanted to discuss with you. Lula forced herself to stay calm. What is it? Isaac leaned against the marble island. I've been thinking about expanding independently, starting my own consulting branch. Her pulse quickened. And I think this is the right time for us to invest in our future. Us. The word almost made her laugh. Isaac smiled slightly. Your father's inheritance could help us build something incredible together. Lula stared at him silently. Hours earlier, she had watched him touch another woman like a man in love. Now he wanted access to her money. And in that moment, standing barefoot in her own kitchen, while rain battered the windows outside, Lula Ferguson realized something far more dangerous than infidelity was happening inside her marriage. Isaac Whitmore did not think she would ever leave him. Isaac Whitmore never raised his voice when he wanted control. That was what made him dangerous. Men who shouted were easy to identify, easy to fear, easy to leave. But Isaac preferred softer weapons. Disappointment, guilt, silence. The ability to make Lula question her own instincts until she apologized for wounds he created. 3 mornings after Lula discovered the affair, Isaac stood in front of the bathroom mirror, adjusting his cufflinks while speaking casually about millions of dollars. As soon as we move the inheritance into the expansion account, things will accelerate. Lula sat at the vanity, brushing mascara onto her lashes carefully. You keep saying we. Isaac smiled faintly at her reflection. Because it is us. No, Lula thought. It was him. Always him. She watched him straighten his tie, the same tie Brooke had touched in the hotel bar, and felt something cold settle permanently inside her chest. You trust me, don't you? Isaac asked. There it was. Not love. Not partnership. Trust. The word manipulative people used when they wanted access to things they hadn't earned. Lula lowered the mascara wand slowly. Of course I trust you. Isaac relaxed immediately. That was the terrifying thing about liars. Once you gave them the answer they want, they stopped looking deeper. He kissed the top of her head before leaving. Lula waited until the front door closed before gripping the edge of the vanity hard enough to hurt her fingers. Then she cried. Not loudly, not dramatically, just silent tears falling onto the marble counter while morning sunlight poured through the windows of the enormous house she suddenly no longer recognized as home. By evening, she had pulled herself back together, because grief inside a toxic marriage rarely arrived cleanly. You still had groceries to put away, laundry to fold, guests to smile at. Isaac returned from work unusually cheerful. There's a dinner Friday, he said, while loosening his tie. Family dinner at my mother's. Lula's stomach tightened instantly. Evelyn Whitmore's dinners were never really dinners. They were evaluations, performances disguised as family gatherings. Do we have to go? Lula asked quietly. Isaac glanced at her. You know how important appearances are right now? Appearances. Not family. Not connection. Appearances. Of course, Lula said softly. Friday night arrived wrapped in snow and expensive perfume. Evelyn Whitmore's estate sat along the lakefront like something torn from a magazine spread about old American wealth. Massive windows, white stone columns, perfect landscaping buried beneath fresh snow. Lula stepped out of the car carefully, in a dark emerald dress Isaac once claimed was his favorite. He barely looked at her. Inside the house glowed gold beneath crystal chandeliers. Everything about Evelyn Whitmore screamed controlled perfection. including Evelyn herself, tall, sharp-featured, elegant in the intimidating way wealthy women sometimes were. She kissed Isaac's cheek warmly the moment they entered. "My son," she said proudly. Then her eyes moved to Lula. "Lula, you look tired, dear." Not hello. Not you look beautiful. Tired. Lula smiled politely. "It's been a busy week." Evelyn gave a soft hum of fake sympathy. "Well, keeping up with Isaac's schedule must be exhausting." Isaac chuckled lightly beside them. Lula felt invisible already. Dinner guests filled the massive dining room within the hour. Executives, investors, family friends with polished smiles and old money confidence. And then Brooke Langley arrived. Lula almost dropped her wine glass. Brooke wore cream silk and diamonds, small enough to look tasteful, but expensive enough to make a statement. She carried herself carefully, not too confident, not too shy. The perfect corporate protégé. Isaac stood immediately when Brooke entered. Too quickly, too naturally. "Brooke," he said warmly, "glad you made it." Brooke smiled at him first before acknowledging anyone else. Then her eyes landed on Lula. For one brief second, something flickered there. Recognition, calculation, victory. "Oh," Brooke said sweetly. "Mrs. Whitmore? It's so nice seeing you again." Lula forced herself to smile. "You too." Brooke sat only 3 seats away from Isaac during dinner, close enough that Lula noticed everything. The private glances, the hidden smiles, the way Isaac listened more carefully when Brooke spoke than when anyone else did. At one point, Brooke laughed at something Isaac whispered, a genuine laugh, soft and intimate. Lula hadn't heard that sound from him in years. Evelyn noticed it too. But instead of discomfort, amusement touched her lips. That realization hurt almost more than the affair itself. Evelyn knew. Maybe not every detail, but enough. Enough to understand there was another woman orbiting her son. Enough to choose silence because protecting Isaac mattered more than protecting Lula. Halfway through dinner, Evelyn lifted her wine glass elegantly. "I have to say," she announced, "Isaac has always had exceptional instincts about people." Several guests nodded approvingly. Evelyn continued smoothly. "That's why his success doesn't surprise me. Strong men recognize value quickly." Her eyes flicked briefly toward Brooke, then toward Lula. The message landed exactly where intended. Brooke lowered her gaze modestly. Isaac said nothing, not one word. Lula felt humiliation crawl slowly beneath her skin. She suddenly understood her role in this family. Decoration. Respectability. The soft wife who hosted dinners and smiled in photographs while Isaac built the exciting parts of his life elsewhere. "You're quiet tonight," Isaac murmured beside her. Lula turned toward him calmly. "Just listening." "That's probably wise," Evelyn said before sipping her wine. The table laughed softly, not cruelly, almost worse. The polite kind of rich people laughter designed to make you feel small without leaving fingerprints. Lula smiled anyway, because breaking down at the table would only entertain them. After dinner, guests drifted toward the sitting room while snow fell heavily outside. Lula stood alone near the hallway for a moment, trying to steady herself. Then Brooke appeared beside her. "You have a beautiful home," Brooke said lightly. Lula almost laughed at the absurdity. "It's Isaac's house too," she replied. Brooke tilted her head slightly. Of course, there was something poisonous hidden beneath her sweetness, something deliberate. Lula studied her carefully for the first time. Brooke wasn't stupid. She knew exactly what she was doing. Maybe Isaac lied to her about the marriage. Maybe he painted Lula as distant or cold. But Brooke still chose this. She still sat at that table, smiling while another woman was quietly humiliated. "You and Isaac work closely together?" Lula asked.
Brooke smiled. Very. The word lingered between them, sharp as glass. Before Lula could respond, Isaac appeared. There you are, he said to Brooke first. Then noticing Lula still standing there, he added casually, Mom's looking for you. Not, are you okay? Not you disappeared. Just another redirection. Another dismissal. Later that night, after they returned home, Lula finally allowed herself to speak. Not about Brooke, not yet, but about the way Isaac treated her. You embarrassed me tonight, she said quietly, while removing her earrings in front of the bedroom mirror. Isaac looked genuinely confused. What are you talking about? You let your mother humiliate me all evening. Isaac exhaled sharply. Lula, not everything is an attack. She implied I contribute nothing. She was joking. She wasn't. Isaac's face hardened immediately. There he is, Lula thought. The real version. The one beneath the charm. You're too sensitive lately, he said coldly. Honestly, I don't know what's happening to you. Lula stared at him through the mirror. Sensitive. The favorite word of selfish men. I gave up my career for this marriage, she whispered. Isaac loosened his watch impatiently. And I gave you this life. The sentence hit harder than shouting would have. Because suddenly, Lula understood something devastating. Isaac believed she owed him gratitude for existing beside him. I supported you, she said quietly. And I've supported you financially for years. There it was again. Money, power, debt. Everything reduced to transaction. Lula turned slowly toward him. Do you even hear yourself? Isaac rubbed a hand across his jaw. You're being emotional. No, Lula replied softly. I'm finally paying attention. Something flickered across his face then. Annoyance. Maybe even caution. But only briefly. Because Isaac still believed he controlled the narrative. He walked closer, lowering his voice. You wouldn't know what to do without me, Lula. The room went completely still. Lula felt the words settle inside her like poison. Not because she believed them anymore, but because she realized he did. Isaac truly thought she was too dependent to leave, too soft to fight back, too broken to survive alone. And in that exact moment, something inside Lula changed permanently. Not loudly, not dramatically, just quietly, like a lock clicking shut. The next morning, after Isaac left for work, Lula sat alone at the kitchen island with her father's old leather document box beside her. Inside were trust records, inheritance papers, property documents, and the business card of Diane Caldwell, the estate attorney who once handled her father's affairs. Lula stared at the card for nearly a full minute before picking up her phone. Her hands trembled slightly as she dialed. Diane answered on the third ring. Diane Caldwell speaking. Lula swallowed hard. Hi, she whispered. My name is Lula Ferguson. I think my husband is trying to take something that doesn't belong to him. A long silence followed. Then Diane's voice became very calm. Mrs. Ferguson, she said carefully, I think you should come see me immediately. Diane Caldwell's office overlooked downtown Chicago from the 32nd floor of a quiet glass tower. The view was stunning. Lula barely noticed it. Her stomach had been in knots since the moment she scheduled the appointment. She sat across from Diane now, clutching a leather folder filled with inheritance records, while snow drifted beyond the windows behind them. Diane Caldwell was in her early 60s, silver-haired, composed, and impossible to intimidate. The kind of woman who had spent decades watching wealthy men underestimate quiet women. Which meant she recognized the look in Lula's eyes immediately. You haven't slept, Diane observed gently. Lula gave a weak smile. Is it that obvious? Yes. Diane opened the folder carefully. Start from the beginning. And for the first time, Lula said it aloud. Not to a friend, not inside her own head, out loud. My husband is having an affair. The words sounded strange in the air, too ugly for the elegant office, too painful to belong to her life. Diane didn't react dramatically. She simply nodded once like someone hearing a familiar story. How long have you known? About 2 weeks. How long has it been happening? Lula swallowed hard. At least 2 years, I think. Diane's expression darkened slightly. And now he wants access to your inheritance. Yes? Diane leaned back in her chair slowly. Mrs. Ferguson, that timing concerns me. Lula stared down at her hands. I keep wondering if I'm overreacting. You're not. The answer came instantly, firmly, no hesitation. Something inside Lula nearly broke from the relief of hearing another woman say it. Diane adjusted her glasses and reviewed several pages quietly before speaking again. Your inheritance is currently protected because it remains separate property. Lula frowned slightly. Meaning unless you voluntarily combine it with marital assets or invest it into your husband's ventures, he has no automatic claim to it. A slow wave of realization moved through Lula's body. Isaac knew that. He had to know that. Which meant the pressure wasn't accidental. It was a strategic. Diane folded her hands neatly. Has your husband asked you to sign anything not yet? He will. Lula felt cold suddenly. Diane's eyes sharpened. Men in financial trouble often become very persuasive before they become desperate. You think he's in financial trouble? I think wealthy men rarely risk stable marriages unless they believe they've secured replacement resources. The sentence settled heavily between them. Replacement resources. That was how Isaac saw people now. Assets, leverage, support systems. Lula stared out the window. I don't understand how someone can lie this easily. Diane's voice softened slightly. Because he's practiced at it. Silence filled the office. Then Diane leaned forward carefully. You need to stop reacting emotionally around him. Lula blinked. But you need information before confrontation. The words felt wrong. Cruel, even. Lula had spent her entire life believing honesty solved problems. That love deserved transparency. But Diane was speaking the language of survival. If you confront him now, Diane continued, he will delete evidence, move money, manipulate records, and possibly try to portray you as unstable. Lula thought about Isaac calling her sensitive, emotional, overreacting, already preparing the narrative. Diane handed her a business card. Mara Jensen, CP, a forensic accounting specialist. She's discreet, Diane said. And very good. Lula turned the card over nervously. This feels insane. Diane's expression became unexpectedly kind. No, she said quietly. This feels like the moment a woman finally realizes she's been standing inside a fire. By the time Lula left the office, Chicago was covered in snow. She sat inside her car for nearly 10 minutes before starting the engine. Her phone buzzed. Isaac. She stared at the screen before answering. Hey, she said softly. Where are you? Isaac asked. At the bookstore downtown. A lie. The first real lie she had ever told him. Isaac sounded distracted. You still coming to dinner tonight? Of course. Good. A pause. And Lula. Yes, I know things have felt tense lately. I just need you to trust me. Trust me. Again. The phrase sounded almost sinister now. Lula closed her eyes briefly. I do. Isaac relaxed instantly. That's my girl. The call ended.
Lula stared at the steering wheel, afterward nausea twisting through her stomach. That's my girl. Not partner. Not wife. Possession. Ownership. She drove home through heavy snow, feeling like she was returning to a stranger's house. That night, Isaac acted unusually affectionate, which terrified her more than cruelty. He kissed her shoulder while she cooked, wrapped his arms around her waist, asked about her day. Men like Isaac always sense distance eventually, even if they didn't understand its cause. At dinner, he poured her wine and smiled easily. "I've been thinking," he said casually. "Maybe we should plan a vacation after the quarter ends." Lula cut into her salmon carefully. "A vacation? Yeah. Somewhere warm. With Brooke." The thought appeared in her mind before she could stop it. But aloud, she only said, "That sounds nice." Isaac smiled. "You deserve nice things." The hypocrisy nearly made her choke. Later that night, while Isaac showered upstairs, Lula sat alone in the kitchen with her laptop open. She created a folder, then another inside it, then another. Finally, she labeled the main folder weather reports. If Isaac ever glanced at her computer, it would sound boring, harmless. Inside, she began saving everything: hotel receipts, screenshots, financial statements, calendar inconsistencies, dates, patterns. She documented every late-night meeting, every unexplained expense, every sudden overnight trip. The process felt surreal, like becoming a detective inside her own marriage. Her hands trembled when she uploaded the first photo: Isaac entering the Langford Hotel with Brooke. Lula stared at the image for a long time afterward. He looked happy. That part hurt most. Not guilty, not conflicted. Happy. A week later, she met Mara Jensen. Mara was nothing like Lula expected from a forensic accountant. She wore leather boots, dark lipstick, and spoke with sharp efficiency. After reviewing several financial statements, Mara looked up slowly. "Well," she said, "your husband's either reckless or arrogant. Probably both." Mara smirked faintly. "Good answer." For the next hour, Mara walked Lula through transaction patterns, expense reimbursements, corporate meal accounts, travel inconsistencies. At first, Lula struggled to follow everything. Then Mara highlighted a series of payments: luxury restaurants, jewelry stores, hotel charges, all categorized under business entertainment. Lula's chest tightened. "He used company money. Looks that way." Mara tapped another section. "And this gets more interesting. Several charges aligned perfectly with weekends Isaac claimed to be traveling for work. But according to reimbursement timestamps, the purchases happened locally, meaning he wasn't out of town. He was with Brooke, using corporate accounts to hide personal spending." Lula pressed a hand against her mouth. "This is real," she whispered. Mara's expression softened slightly. "Yeah." The reality of it hit differently now. This wasn't just betrayal, it was calculation. Isaac had built an entire parallel life while using Lula's loyalty as camouflage. As they prepared to leave, Mara paused near the cafe entrance. "One more thing." Lula looked up. "If he's hiding financial behavior this aggressively," Mara said carefully, "there's usually more you haven't found yet." That sentence haunted Lula all weekend, because suddenly every interaction with Isaac felt layered, manufactured. Sunday afternoon, Isaac sat beside her on the couch, pretending to watch television while texting constantly. His screen lit up briefly. "B." Lula looked away immediately before he noticed. Isaac smiled faintly at whatever message he received. Then he reached over and touched Lula's knee absent-mindedly. The casual cruelty of it made her skin crawl. That night, after Isaac fell asleep, Lula quietly walked downstairs for water. The house was dark and silent. As she passed the front entryway, she froze. A large white envelope rested against the door. No stamp, no address, just left there. Her pulse quickened instantly. Lula picked it up carefully. Inside was a photograph. Brooke Langley entering a luxury apartment building downtown, time-stamped 3 nights earlier. Lula turned the photo over slowly. Written in black ink were 6 words. "You are not the only one he's lying to." Cold fear spread through her body immediately. Someone else knew. Someone had been watching. And suddenly, Lula realized her marriage contained far more secrets than an affair. Somewhere in Chicago, another person understood exactly who Isaac Whitmore really was. Lula barely slept after finding the envelope. She kept replaying the handwritten sentence in her mind. "You are not the only one he's lying to." At 3 in the morning, she sat alone in the dark kitchen, wearing one of Isaac's old sweaters, staring at the photograph of Brooke entering the luxury apartment building downtown. The timestamp glowed in the corner. 11:42 p.m. 3 nights ago. Isaac had told Lula he was in Milwaukee meeting investors. The lie itself no longer shocked her. What unsettled her now was the realization that someone else had been watching Isaac closely enough to document him. Someone angry enough to send proof. The next morning, Lula slid the photograph across the table toward Mara at a quiet cafe near the river. Mara studied it carefully. "Interesting," she murmured. "You think whoever sent it works with Isaac maybe?" Mara leaned back thoughtfully. "Or maybe someone else got hurt." Lula's stomach tightened. "How many women do you think there are?" Mara gave her a sympathetic look. "Honestly, I don't know." That answer hurt more than certainty would have. Mara flipped the photo over. "But this building?" She pulled out her phone and typed quickly. A minute later, she turned the screen toward Lula. "Luxury high-rise, private concierge, short-term executive rentals available through corporate holding companies." Mara narrowed her eyes. "Your husband didn't lease this personally. How can you tell men like Isaac don't leave fingerprints when they cheat?" The sentence made Lula feel cold. Mara continued scrolling. "But whoever arranged the unit used a shell company connected to Whitmore Strategic Consulting." Lula blinked slowly. "His company, indirectly. So he used corporate structures to hide the apartment. Looks that way?" Lula sat back in stunned silence. The affair had already devastated her emotionally. But this was calculated, layered, planned. Isaac hadn't stumbled into betrayal. He had engineered it carefully. Later that afternoon, Lula drove downtown alone. She told herself she only wanted to see the building, nothing more. The high-rise towered over the street in glass and steel elegance. Wealthy professionals moved through the lobby, carrying expensive coffee and designer briefcases. Lula stayed across the street inside her car. At first, she felt ridiculous. Then Brooke appeared. Her hair was tied loosely back oversized sunglasses, covering half her face despite the gray winter sky. She looked comfortable there. Not nervous, not secretive. Comfortable. Brooke exited the building carrying dry cleaning and laughing softly at something on her phone. Lula stared at her. This woman wasn't behaving like someone trapped in an affair. She behaved like someone building a future. And suddenly, Lula understood something deeply painful. Isaac had probably promised Brooke a life. Maybe not immediately, maybe with excuses, complications, timing, but enough to keep her waiting. Enough to make her feel chosen. Lula watched Brooke disappear into a waiting car service before finally driving home with tears burning behind her eyes. Not because she envied Brooke, but because she remembered being loved that way once. or at least believing she was. That evening, Isaac came home unusually early.
He loosened his coat and smiled when he saw Lula in the kitchen. "There's my girl." Lula nearly flinched at the phrase now. Ownership disguised as affection. Isaac poured himself bourbon before leaning casually against the counter. "I talked to Ethan today," he said. "His wife's pregnant again." Lula kept chopping vegetables carefully. "Oh." Isaac studied her. "You ever think about that?" The knife paused in her hand. "A baby." "Yeah." His tone sounded almost thoughtful, normal, which somehow made it worse. Lula turned slowly toward him. "Where is this coming from?" Isaac shrugged. "We've been married 7 years. So maybe it's time." Lula stared at him in disbelief. This man was sleeping with another woman, building secret apartments, trying to access her inheritance. And now he wanted a child. A child would tie her to him forever. Financially, emotionally, legally. The realization moved through her body like ice water. Isaac stepped closer, lowering his voice gently. "I think we've both been distant lately," he said. "Maybe this is exactly what we need." Need. The word felt manipulative now. Everything sounded manipulative now. Lula forced herself to stay calm. "I thought you said your career needed full focus." Isaac smiled faintly. "Some things matter more than work." The hypocrisy nearly made her sick. But she smiled anyway, because reacting emotionally would only make him more careful. 2 days later, Isaac forwarded her an appointment confirmation for a fertility consultation. No discussion, no mutual decision, just an appointment. Lula stared at the email for nearly a full minute. Then she closed her laptop and cried quietly in the bathroom where Isaac couldn't hear her. Not because she desperately wanted children, but because she realized how little her feelings mattered inside her own marriage. Everything revolved around Isaac's timeline, Isaac's image, Isaac's control. The fertility clinic sat inside a pristine medical building overlooking Lake Michigan. Lula arrived alone. Isaac texted 30 minutes before the appointment. "Emergency meeting. Can't make it." "Sorry, baby." Baby. The word made her chest ache. In the waiting room, couples sat beside each other, holding hands nervously. Some looked hopeful, others exhausted. But all of them looked united. Lula had never felt more alone in her life. A young husband kissed his wife's forehead gently while they filled out paperwork together. The tenderness of it nearly broke her. Because suddenly, Lula realized something devastating. She no longer trusted Isaac enough to create a family with him. Not emotionally, not morally, not safely. During the consultation, the doctor asked careful questions about stress levels and marital support systems. Lula answered automatically, politely, like a woman performing normalcy, but inside panic screamed louder with every passing minute. By the time she reached the parking garage afterward, her hands were shaking uncontrollably. She sat inside her car and whispered the truth aloud for the first time. "I cannot have a child with this man." The words terrified her, because once spoken, they became real. That night, Isaac returned home carrying flowers. White roses. Lula almost laughed at the timing. "I'm sorry I missed today," he said smoothly. "Things are crazy at work." Lula accepted the flowers quietly. Isaac kissed her cheek. "We'll figure everything out together." Together. The biggest lie in their marriage. Later that evening, Isaac entered the living room carrying a sleek black folder. "I need your opinion on something." Lula looked up slowly. Isaac sat beside her on the couch and opened the folder carefully. Legal documents, dense paragraphs, highlighted sections. Her pulse immediately quickened. "What is this, just paperwork?" Isaac said casually. "Standard financial protection stuff before the expansion."
Lula turned several pages slowly. Post-nuptial agreement. Her stomach dropped. Isaac watched her closely now. Too closely. This protects both of us, he explained smoothly. Especially once we start investing larger amounts together. Lula kept reading. Contribution clauses, business liability structures, shared asset growth terms. Language complicated enough to confuse most people. But even without Diane present, Lula could feel danger woven into every page. Why now? She asked quietly. Isaac smiled patiently. Because smart couples plan ahead. No. Smart predators planned ahead. Lula looked up at him. For one terrifying second, she wondered how many rehearsed conversations he'd already had about this with Brooke. How many times they'd discussed her money, her future, her life. Isaac reached for her hand gently. If we're serious about building something long-term, this matters. The irony was almost unbearable. He already had another life downtown, another woman, another future. But he still wanted ownership over this one too. Lula forced herself to breathe steadily. What if I want a lawyer to review it? Something flickered across Isaac's face instantly, gone within a second. But she saw it. Annoyance. Danger. Then the charming smile returned. A loyal wife wouldn't need lawyers involved over something built on trust. Trust. Again. Always trust. Never honesty. Never transparency. Never fidelity. Just trust. Lula lowered her eyes back to the document so Isaac wouldn't see the shift happening inside her. Because at that exact moment she stopped seeing the postnup as paperwork and started seeing it for what it truly was. A trap. Isaac Whitmore did not like delays, especially when the delay came from Lula. For years, she had been easy. Easy to persuade, easy to guilt, easy to soften with flowers, apologies, expensive dinners, and just enough affection to keep her emotionally loyal. So when 3 days passed without the signed postnuptial agreement returning to his desk, Isaac's patience began to crack. Not openly. Never openly. But Lula noticed it in the little things. The tension in his jaw, the shorter replies, the way his eyes lingered on her now, not lovingly but cautiously. Like a businessman evaluating risk. Saturday morning, Lula stood at the kitchen counter pouring coffee when Isaac walked in, already dressed for the day. Tailored charcoal coat, perfect hair, phone in hand, control wrapped in expensive fabric. "You've been quiet," he said casually. Lula handed him a mug. "I've been thinking. About the agreement." Isaac took the coffee slowly, and Lula forced herself to appear uncertain instead of alarmed. "It's a lot to process." Isaac smiled, but the warmth didn't reach his eyes. "Lula, it's paperwork, not a hostage negotiation." She lowered her gaze slightly. For years, she would have apologized right there, would have worried about sounding difficult. But now she could see the manipulation clearly. Minimize her concern, make her feel dramatic, pressure her emotionally until compliance felt easier than resistance. Isaac stepped closer. "You know I'd never hurt you, right?" The lie almost stunned her with its audacity, not because he believed it, but because he expected her to. Lula swallowed carefully. "Then why do I feel pressured?" For a brief second, irritation flashed across his face. "There it is again," he muttered. "What this version of you lately?" Lula looked up slowly. "What version?" "The suspicious version. The emotional version. The inconvenient version." He didn't say those last parts aloud. He didn't have to. Isaac sighed dramatically and set his coffee down. "I'm trying to build something for us," he said. "Do you know how insulting it feels that you don't trust me enough to sign basic protections?" Protections. Another pretty word hiding ugliness. Lula kept her expression soft. What if I just want time? Isaac stared at her. And for the first time in their marriage, Lula saw something dangerous flicker beneath his calm. Fear. Tiny. Fast. But real. Because Isaac was beginning to understand something he never expected. Lula was no longer moving automatically in the direction he pushed her. That afternoon, Evelyn Whitmore called. Of course she did. Lula sat in the sunroom answering emails when her phone lit up with her mother-in-law's name. Evelyn never called casually. Every interaction had purpose. Hello, Evelyn.
Lula, darling. Evelyn's voice carried polished sweetness, sharpened by control. How are you? I'm fine. A pause. Then Evelyn moved directly toward the target. Isaac mentioned there's some hesitation regarding the financial paperwork. There it was. Lula stared out at the frozen backyard silently. He shouldn't discuss private conversations with you. Evelyn laughed softly. Oh, sweetheart. Marriage and business are never private in families like ours. Families like ours, meaning wealthy, strategic, transactional. Lula suddenly realized Evelyn viewed marriage less as love and more as infrastructure. You know, Evelyn continued, when Isaac's father started expanding his company, I signed whatever needed signing. Of course you did, Lula thought. Because women like Evelyn survive by attaching themselves to powerful men and calling obedience wisdom. He needed support, Evelyn said. That's what strong wives do. Lula gripped the phone tighter. What if the wife feels uncomfortable? Evelyn's tone cooled slightly. Then perhaps she should ask herself why. There it was again. The implication that Lula's discomfort itself was failure. The healthy women trusted blindly. The questioning manipulation was betrayal. Evelyn sighed dramatically. Isaac works very hard to provide this life. This life. The massive house. The luxury dinners. The social status. The cage disguised as privilege. Lula spoke carefully. I supported Isaac too. Yeah, Evelyn replied lightly emotionally. The dismissal hit like a slap, as though Lula's sacrifices had been decorative instead of foundational, as though giving up her own career dreams, identity, and independence meant nothing because it wasn't measured in corporate revenue. Evelyn lowered her voice. Men with ambition require peace at home, Lula. Don't become another source of stress in his life. The call ended minutes later, but the anger stayed. Not explosive anger, worse. The slow burning kind. The kind built from years of being reduced politely. That evening, Lula met Diane Caldwell privately. She slid the post-nuptial agreement across Diane's desk. Diane read silently for nearly 20 minutes. The deeper she read, the colder her expression became. Finally, she removed her glasses. Well, she said flatly, this is aggressive. Lula's stomach tightened. Meaning your husband either thinks you're naive or emotionally dependent enough not to question this. Lula almost laughed at how accurate that sounded. Diane tapped several highlighted sections. These clauses are structured to gradually convert portions of your separate inheritance into marital growth assets if invested into his expansion. Lula frowned. In English, if you sign this and move money into his business, protecting that inheritance later becomes significantly harder. A cold wave moved through Lula's body. So he's trying to secure access legally before anything changes. Diane finished quietly. Lula looked away. The affair suddenly felt connected to everything. Not separate. Not emotional weakness. A system. Isaac wanted freedom, money, image, and control simultaneously. And he believed Lula existed to stabilize all of it. Diane folded the agreement shut. Do not sign this. I won't. Good. Diane studied her carefully. Has he become more emotionally intense since you delayed? Yes. Expected. Lula blinked.
Expected. Control feels safest to people like Isaac. Delays threaten control. That sentence lingered heavily. Control, not love. Never love. Lula exhaled shakily. I don't even recognize my own marriage anymore. Diane's eyes softened slightly. You're recognizing it for the first time. The truth of that nearly broke her.
Later that week, Mara invited Lula to her office after uncovering more financial irregularities. Stacks of printed records covered Mara's desk. Expense reports, travel reimbursements, corporate dining invoices. Mara pointed at one highlighted line. See these luxury spa charges, private dining services, transportation accounts, all disguised under client entertainment expenses. Isaac and Brooke Lula asked quietly. Almost certainly. Mara clicked another screen open.
And this gets worse. Several reimbursement approvals appeared under Brooke Langley's employee credentials, meaning Brooke herself may have processed or approved some of the false expenses. Lula sat down slowly. She helped him. Looks like it? The betrayal deepened in an entirely new way. Not just emotionally, professionally, strategically. Brooke wasn't merely sleeping with Isaac. She was participating in the concealment. Mara leaned back in her chair.
You know what the crazy part is? What he's getting sloppier. Lula frowned. Why? Because he thinks he's winning. That sentence stayed with Lula all the way home. Isaac thought he was winning. Winning the affair. Winning the financial manipulation. Winning the marriage. Winning control. Which meant he was becoming careless. That night, Isaac arrived home carrying takeout from Lula's favorite Italian restaurant. A peace offering, or distraction. Maybe both. He kissed her cheek softly. Thought we could have a quiet night together. Lula smiled gently. Sounds nice? They ate beside the fireplace while Isaac talked about upcoming business opportunities, expansion plans, potential partnerships, investor confidence. Every sentence now sounded different to Lula. Not because she suddenly hated him, that would have been easier. No. What terrified her most was realizing she no longer trusted anything he said. At one point, Isaac reached across the couch and brushed her hair behind her ear. You know I love you, right? Lula's chest tightened painfully. Because once upon a time, those words would have healed her instantly. Now they felt rehearsed, strategic. Like another tool. She forced a small smile. I know. Isaac relaxed visibly again. That was becoming his pattern. Testing her emotional temperature constantly. Making sure she remained manageable. As the evening ended, Isaac stood near the staircase adjusting his watch. Oh, he said casually, there's a corporate gala next month. Lula looked up. Okay, I'll need you there. Need. Again, not want, need. The board will be attending, Isaac continued. It's important they see stability. Stability. Lula suddenly understood exactly what he meant. A polished wife, a beautiful marriage, a trustworthy image, camouflage. Isaac smiled confidently. And Brooke's helping organize parts of the event. You remember her? Lula held his gaze calmly. Yes, she said softly. I remember Brooke. Isaac smiled, completely unaware of the shift happening beneath her calm expression. Because while he still believed he controlled the story, Lula had already started learning how to survive inside it. The gala took place inside the Blackstone Grand Hotel overlooking downtown Chicago. Everything about the evening screamed wealth. Crystal chandeliers, champagne towers, string quartets playing beneath golden light. Women wrapped in satin and diamonds. Men discussing mergers beside marble columns as if millions of dollars were casual conversation. And at the center of it all stood Isaac Whitmore,
Perfect posture, perfect tuxedo, perfect smile. The rising corporate star. Lula stepped out of the car beside him, wearing a dark silver gown that clung elegantly to her frame. The dress had once been one of Isaac's favorites. Tonight, he barely looked at her. His attention was elsewhere. Always elsewhere. "You look beautiful," he said automatically while checking his phone. Not because he truly saw her, because beautiful wives completed successful men. Lula smiled softly. "Thank you." Inside the ballroom, investors and executives greeted Isaac warmly. "Whitmore. There he is. You're killing it this quarter." Isaac thrived in rooms like this. He moved through conversations effortlessly, shaking hands, laughing at the right moments, performing ambition like an art form. Lula followed beside him like she had for years. The elegant wife, the stable image, the proof that Isaac Whitmore could be trusted. And suddenly, that realization made her feel physically ill. She wasn't his partner tonight. She was branding. One executive's wife squeezed Lula's arm affectionately. "You must be so proud of him." Lula almost laughed. Instead, she said, "Very." The lie tasted bitter. An hour into the event, Brooke Langley arrived. And even though Lula expected it, the sight still hurt. Brooke wore a champagne-colored silk gown with delicate diamond earrings that glittered beneath the chandeliers. Expensive, tasteful, familiar. Lula recognized the jeweler instantly. Isaac had used their joint account there 3 months ago. The charge he claimed was for a client gift. Her stomach twisted violently. Brooke approached their group with polished confidence. "Isaac," she said warmly. His face changed the second he looked at her. That was the unbearable part. The softness, the ease, the version of him Lula used to receive. "Brooke," Isaac said, smiling too quickly. Then he remembered Lula standing beside him. "Oh, you two remember each other."
Remember? As if Brooke were some distant acquaintance instead of the woman sleeping with her husband. Brooke turned gracefully toward Lula. "Mrs. Whitmore, you look stunning tonight." Lula met her eyes calmly. "So do you." For one brief second, tension flickered beneath Brooke's smile. Not guilt. Competition. Like Brooke needed to know whether Lula suspected anything. Isaac interrupted smoothly. "Brooke's been incredible helping coordinate investor relations for the expansion." Expansion. The same expansion he wanted Lula's inheritance to fund. Brooke lowered her gaze modestly. "Isaac gives me too much credit." "No," Lula thought. "He gives you everything." The realization hurt so sharply, she almost stopped breathing. Throughout the evening, Lula watched carefully. Not emotionally anymore, strategically. And once she stopped viewing the affair through heartbreak alone, she noticed everything. How often Isaac found reasons to stand near Brooke. How Brooke instinctively touched his arm while laughing. How they shared private glances across crowded rooms. Tiny things. Invisible to everyone else. Obvious to a wife. At one point, Isaac disappeared for nearly 20 minutes. When he returned, Brooke's lipstick looked freshly reapplied. Lula said nothing. That was becoming her superpower. Silence. Not helpless silence. Observant silence. Dangerous silence.
Later in the evening, guests gathered near the ballroom stage for Isaac's presentation about the company's future expansion strategy. Lula stood beside Evelyn Whitmore near the front. Evelyn adjusted her diamond bracelet and murmured quietly, "Isaac was born for rooms like this." Lula kept her eyes on the stage. "He certainly enjoys attention." Evelyn glanced sideways at her. "Ambition attracts attention." Translation: successful men deserve admiration, even when it destroys people around them. Isaac stepped onto the stage confidently as applause filled the room. He thanked investors, praised the executive board, discussed growth projections. Then his gaze landed on Lula. "There's one person," he said warmly, "who supported me through every step of this journey." Applause began immediately. Lula felt her stomach tighten. Isaac smiled at her publicly. "My wife Lula." People turned toward her admiringly. Several women smiled.
Someone whispered, "Couple goals, if only they knew." Isaac continued speaking smoothly. "She's believed in me even during the hardest moments. And honestly, this next chapter wouldn't be possible without her support." Lula froze. There it was. The setup. The implication. Investors nearby nodded approvingly. One board member leaned toward another. Good. Stability matters. Isaac was using her publicly. Again. Turning her loyalty into credibility. Turning their marriage into business collateral. And the worst part? Everyone admired him for it. After the speech, applause thundered through the ballroom. Isaac stepped down, smiling triumphantly. Brooke looked at him with unmistakable admiration. Lula suddenly felt trapped inside a performance everyone else mistook for love. A few minutes later, she slipped away toward the restroom just to breathe. The silence inside felt heavenly compared to the ballroom noise. Lula gripped the edge of the marble sink and stared at herself in the mirror. Perfect makeup. Elegant dress. Dead eyes. "You're handling this surprisingly well." Brooke's voice appeared behind her. Lula closed her eyes briefly before turning around. Brooke stood near the doorway, touching up lipstick casually. "You shouldn't sneak up on people," Lula said calmly. Brooke smiled faintly. "Sorry." No, she wasn't. The silence stretched between them. Then Brooke tilted her head slightly. "Can I be honest?" Lula already knew she would anyway. Brooke capped her lipstick slowly. Some women hold on to marriages long after the relationship is already over. The cruelty arrived dressed as sophistication. Lula leaned lightly against the counter. And some women mistake attention for love. Brooke's smile tightened. Interesting. A nerve. Brooke crossed her arms carefully. Isaac deserves someone who understands his world. Lula's heartbeat slowed instead of quickened. For the first time, anger no longer controlled her. Clarity did. "And what world is that?" Lula asked softly. Brooke gave a tiny shrug. "Ambition. Growth. Real partnership." Partnership. The irony almost made Lula laugh. Brooke stepped closer. "I don't think Isaac means to hurt you." "No. Men like Isaac preferred convenience over cruelty." The destruction was simply collateral damage. Lula looked directly into Brooke's eyes. "How long have you been sleeping with my husband?" The question hit hard enough to crack Brooke's composure briefly. "There it is," Brooke murmured quietly. Neither denial nor apology. Just confirmation. Lula kept her face calm. Inside her clutch purse, her phone recorded everything. Brooke looked at her reflection in the mirror before speaking again. "For what it's worth, Isaac said your marriage has been emotionally over for a long time." Lula almost pitied her. Almost. Because Brooke truly believed she was special, chosen, different. He said he stayed because leaving would complicate finances. Brooke continued softly. But eventually people stopped pretending. There it was. The inheritance, the timing. Everything connected perfectly now. Lula's pulse remained steady. How long Brooke hesitated. Then quietly, almost 2 years. The words landed like glass sliding beneath Lula's skin. Still, she stayed calm. Brooke misread that calmness entirely. "I know this is painful," she said. "But honestly, Isaac needs someone who challenges him." Lula stared at her.
This woman sat inside a luxury hotel wearing earrings bought with marital money while lecturing the wife about emotional maturity. The audacity was breathtaking. Then Brooke made the mistake. The fatal mistake. She smiled faintly and said, "Isaac told me you're too soft to fight for yourself anyway." Silence filled the restroom. Brooke probably expected tears. Maybe humiliation, maybe collapse. Instead, Lula slowly washed her hands beneath warm water and looked at Brooke through the mirror. "Soft women still have teeth," Lula said quietly. "We just don't show them to everyone." For the first time that night, uncertainty flickered across Brooke's face. Only for a second. But Lula saw it. Then the ballroom doors opened outside. Music drifted back in. Voices. Laughter. Isaac calling Brooke's name faintly from somewhere down the hallway. Brooke straightened immediately. The devoted mistress returning to her role. Before leaving, she looked back once. "You should let him go gracefully." Lula smiled softly. The saddest part, Brooke still thought this story was about winning Isaac. She had no idea it was about survival now. After Brooke disappeared, Lula reached into her clutch purse slowly. Her phone screen glowed. Recording saved successfully. A perfect clear audio file. Every confession. Every insult. Every admission. Lula stared at the screen for several seconds before pressing another button. Upload to cloud storage, then another and another. 3 separate backups. Because women like Lula learned quickly. Never trust a man who thinks you're too emotional to prepare. When she finally walked back into the ballroom, Isaac smiled warmly the moment he saw her approaching. Like nothing in the world was wrong. Like betrayal looked beautiful beneath chandelier light. And for the first time since discovering the affair, Lula smiled back without breaking inside. Because now she finally had proof. The strangest part about heartbreak, Lula realized, was how quiet it became after the shock wore off. At first, betrayal felt like drowning. Panic, pain, sleepless nights. But eventually, the grief settled into something colder. A constant ache humming beneath daily life. And somewhere inside that ache, Lula Ferguson began rebuilding herself. Not loudly, not dramatically, quietly, dangerously. 3 days after the gala, Lula sat inside a therapist's office for the first time in her life. The room smelled faintly like lavender and old books. Warm lighting, soft chairs, safe silence. Dr. Naomi Bennett smiled gently from across the room. "What brought you here?" Lula almost answered automatically. "Stress, marriage issues, anxiety." But something inside her was too exhausted to lie anymore. "My husband has been cheating on me for almost 2 years," she whispered. The words cracked open in the middle of the room. Raw, ugly, real. Dr. Bennett didn't look shocked, just attentive. "And when did you find out? Months ago? And have you confronted him?" Lula shook her head slowly. "No." Why? Lula stared down at her hands. "Because I was scared. Because I needed time. Because he controls everything. Because I stopped recognizing myself years ago." Instead, she said quietly, "I think I needed to survive before I could leave." Dr. Bennett nodded slowly. "That makes sense." The kindness in her voice almost made Lula cry. Session after session, pieces of Lula's marriage began rearranging themselves into clarity. Gaslighting, financial coercion, emotional manipulation, control disguised as protection. Dr. Bennett gave names to things Lula had normalized for years. And once named, they became impossible to ignore. One afternoon, Dr. Bennett asked softly, "When was the last time you made a decision only for yourself?" Lula opened her mouth, then stopped, because she genuinely couldn't remember. That realization haunted her all week. So she started small, very small. She joined a Pilates studio downtown. Not because Isaac wanted her to. Not because appearances required it. Because she liked how strong her body felt afterward. She changed her hair slightly. Softer layers. Shorter length. When Isaac noticed, he blinked in surprise. New look. Lula smiled lightly. I wanted a change. He stared at her for a second too long. Like he sensed movement beneath the surface, but couldn't identify it yet. Then came the clothes. Not flashy. Not revenge dresses. Just things Lula genuinely loved, but had stopped wearing because Isaac preferred classic styles. Deep blues, cashmere coats, gold jewelry she chose for herself. Every tiny decision felt strangely revolutionary, because for years, Lula had shaped herself around Isaac's preferences until she almost disappeared entirely. Now she was learning herself again piece by piece. And Isaac noticed. Of course he noticed. One evening he watched her applying lipstick before dinner and smiled faintly. You've been different lately. Lula met his gaze in the mirror. Different how, I don't know. He walked closer, slowly. Lighter. The irony nearly destroyed her. She looked lighter because she had emotionally stopped carrying him. Isaac wrapped his arms loosely around her waist. I've missed this version of you. This version. Meaning agreeable, polished, interesting again. Men like Isaac often rediscovered attraction the moment women stopped chasing them. Lula smiled softly without answering. Because she finally understood something important, Isaac didn't miss her pain. He missed her attention. A week later, Lula met Rebecca Sloan for lunch downtown. Rebecca had once been her mentor at the Children's Hospital Foundation years ago. Warm, sharp, compassionate. The kind of woman who made younger women feel capable. The moment Rebecca saw Lula walk into the restaurant, her face lit up. There she is. Lula smiled genuinely for the first time in weeks. Over lunch, Rebecca spoke passionately about a new pediatric wing fundraising campaign. We could really use someone with your skill set again. Lula blinked in surprise. Me? Yes, you? Rebecca laughed softly. You are brilliant at this. Past tense. Because Lula herself had almost forgotten. Isaac certainly had. For years he spoke about her old career, like a sweet little hobby she used to enjoy before becoming his wife. But Rebecca remembered the truth. Lula had been exceptional. You built relationships better than anyone I've ever worked with. Rebecca continued. People trusted you. Trusted. The word landed differently now. Not as manipulation. As respect. Lula looked down at her coffee quietly. I don't know if I remember how. Rebecca's expression softened immediately. Oh, sweetheart, she said gently. That part of you never disappeared. Someone just convinced you it did. Lula nearly cried right there at the table.
Instead, she agreed to consult part-time on the campaign. Under her maiden name, Lula Ferguson, not Mrs. Whitmore, not Isaac's wife, just Lula. The first time she walked back into the hospital foundation offices, emotion hit her so hard she had to pause in the hallway. Everything smelled familiar. Coffee, printer paper, flowers from donor arrangements, purpose. Staff members greeted her warmly. Several remembered her instantly. And for the first time in years, Lula existed in a room where nobody cared who her husband was. The feeling was intoxicating. Meanwhile, Mara continued digging deeper into Isaac's finances. One rainy Thursday afternoon, Mara called Lula urgently. You need to see this. Lula arrived at Mara's office 20 minutes later. Stacks of financial reports covered the desk again. Mara pointed toward highlighted sections. The company board review is in 6 weeks. Lula frowned. Okay.
Okay, means your husband's entire future depends on appearing stable right now. The realization clicked instantly. The happy marriage, the gala, the public affection. Isaac wasn't merely protecting appearances socially. He was protecting them professionally. Mara tapped another page. If these reimbursement irregularities surface before the review he's done. Lula stared silently. Done. Such a simple word for total collapse. Mara leaned back in her chair carefully. Lula, I need to ask something difficult. What exactly do you want? The question lingered heavily. Revenge, justice, humiliation, freedom. Lula thought about it honestly, then quietly said, I want my life back. And suddenly, she realized that was true. Not revenge, not destruction. She simply wanted herself again. That evening, Isaac came home carrying flowers and expensive takeout. Again. Love bombing. The pattern had become obvious now. Anytime Lula pulled emotionally away, Isaac increased affection strategically. You've been working a lot lately, he observed casually while unpacking dinner. So have you. He smiled slightly. Touché. They ate by candlelight in the dining room. Beautiful. Elegant. Emotionally dead. Halfway through dinner, Isaac reached across the table. I've been thinking maybe we should go to Aspen after the board review. Lula looked at him calmly. A vacation.
Yeah. He smiled warmly. Just us. Us. There was something tragic about how easily he still said it. Lula tilted her head slightly. Why now? Isaac hesitated for half a second. Tiny, but revealing. I guess I just miss feeling connected to you. Connected. Not sorry. Not accountable. Connected. Because connection mattered when he felt her slipping away. Lula sipped her wine slowly. You know, she said softly, sometimes I think you only notice me when you're afraid of losing me. Silence filled the room instantly. Isaac's expression tightened, then smoothed out again. You know that's not true. Lula smiled gently. The saddest part. He probably believed himself. Later that night, after Isaac fell asleep, Lula sat alone in the dark living room with her laptop open. The folder labeled the weather reports had become enormous now. Audio recordings, financial spreadsheets, photographs, timeline notes, screenshots, evidence. But tonight, Lula opened a new blank document instead. At the top, she typed, "What I want my life to look like after this." She stared at the blinking cursor for a long time, then slowly began typing. Peace, work that matters, a home that feels safe, sleep without anxiety, love that doesn't require shrinking. Her hands trembled as tears filled her eyes. Because for the first time in years, Lula Ferguson was finally imagining a future that did not revolve around surviving Isaac Whitmore. And somewhere deep inside her, the woman he thought was too soft to fight back was beginning to disappear. In her place, someone quieter and far more dangerous was waking up. Isaac Whitmore announced the anniversary party the same way he announced most important things in their marriage, as if the decision had already been made. We're doing something big this year, he said one evening while scrolling through venue photos on his tablet. Lula sat across from him in the living room, reviewing hospital fundraising proposals. Big? She asked calmly. Isaac smirked faintly. Investors, board members, a few media people. Nothing too dramatic. Nothing too dramatic. Only a luxury rooftop event celebrating a marriage that had been dead for years. Lula watched him carefully. He looked excited. Not emotionally, strategically.
The board review was now less than a month away. Every appearance mattered. Every perception mattered. And Isaac intended to parade their marriage like proof of character. People trust stability, he explained casually, especially in leadership. There it was. Not romance, not celebration, marketing. Lula closed her folder quietly. You want our marriage to look successful? Isaac glanced up. Well, it is successful. The lie no longer hurt the way it used to. Now it simply revealed him. Like watching someone accidentally confess without realizing it. Over the next 2 weeks, the anniversary party consumed their lives. Event planners visited the house constantly. Florists, design consultants, catering directors. Isaac obsessed over every detail. Guest placement, lighting, wine pairings, music selection. Everything needed to communicate elegance, wealth, stability, power. And throughout all of it, Brooke hovered nearby like a ghost dressed in silk. She's helping coordinate investor hospitality, Isaac explained casually one afternoon when Lula found Brooke reviewing seating charts in his office. Of course she was. Brooke looked up smoothly. We're trying to make sure key people feel prioritized. We? The word landed sharply. Lula smiled politely. I'm sure Isaac appreciates your dedication. Brooke held her gaze a fraction too long. Always. The tension between them had changed now. Before Brooke believed Lula was clueless. Now she understood Lula knew. But Brooke still underestimated her. That would become important later. A few nights before the party, Evelyn Whitmore invited Lula over privately. The invitation alone made Lula uneasy. Evelyn rarely requested time alone unless she intended to influence something. The Whitmore estate glowed beneath winter lights when Lula arrived. Inside, Evelyn poured tea into delicate porcelain cups with practiced elegance. You've lost weight, Evelyn observed casually. Stress, Lula replied. Evelyn gave a soft hum. Marriage has difficult seasons. Seasons. As though betrayal were weather instead of choice. Lula sat quietly while Evelyn studied her carefully. Then Evelyn opened a velvet jewelry box on the table between them. Inside rested a diamond necklace so expensive it barely looked real. Old money, generational wealth, the kind of jewelry families use to symbolize legacy. This belonged to Isaac's grandmother, Evelyn said softly. Lula looked up slowly. I want you to wear it at the anniversary party. The gesture should have felt meaningful. Instead, it felt suffocating, like being decorated for display. Evelyn touched the necklace gently. The Whitmore women wear this during important family milestones. Family. The irony almost made Lula laugh, because nothing about this family had protected her. Not emotionally, not morally, certainly not loyally. Still, Lula smiled softly. It's beautiful. Evelyn leaned back slightly. You know, she said carefully, people envy marriages like yours. Lula met her gaze calmly. Do they? Yes. Evelyn's expression sharpened subtly, which is why protecting appearances matters. There it was. The truth, not happiness. Appearances. Evelyn lowered her voice. Whatever tension exists between you and Isaac, I trust you're wise enough not to create unnecessary embarrassment. The threat arrived wrapped in sophistication. Lula almost admired it. Almost. Instead, she asked quietly, did appearances matter when Isaac started sleeping with another woman? Silence crashed into the room. Evelyn froze. Only briefly, but long enough. Lula watched the blood drain slightly from her face. Interesting. Evelyn recovered quickly. I don't know what accusations you're making. You do? Lula said softly. For the first time in years, Evelyn looked unsettled. Not guilty, not ashamed, worried. Because the obedient wife was no longer staying inside the script. Evelyn set down her teacup carefully. Men make mistakes.
Lula stared at her in disbelief. Mistakes. Such a small word for years of betrayal. For 2 years, Lula asked quietly. Evelyn's expression hardened. A smart woman knows when preserving a family matters more than indulging emotions. There it was, the generational poison. Women swallowing pain to protect powerful men. Women teaching other women silence and calling it wisdom. Lula stood slowly. I used to think you were cold, she said quietly. Evelyn's eyes narrowed. But now I think you're just lonely. The sentence landed harder than shouting ever could. Lula left before Evelyn could respond. And for the first time in years, she drove home without feeling intimidated by the Whitmore name. 3 days before the anniversary party, Mara arrived at Lula's house carrying a thick file folder. We're ready, she said simply. Lula's pulse quickened instantly. Inside the folder were organized financial reports, reimbursement trails, copies of expense records, corporate inconsistencies, and timeline summaries. Mara had built everything carefully, professionally, undeniably. Diane reviewed everything Lula asked. Yes, and Mara looked directly at her. If this goes public near the board review, Isaac's career is finished. Finished. The word echoed heavily. Lula stared at the evidence spread across the dining table. All these months,
All this pain, all this pretending, and now the truth existed physically in front of her. Mara softened slightly. You don't have to do this publicly. Lula looked up. What do you mean? You could leave quietly. File privately. Protect yourself without detonating his reputation. Lula considered that honestly. For a moment she imagined simply disappearing. A clean divorce. No confrontation. No exposure. Peace. But then she remembered Isaac using her publicly at the gala. Brooke humiliating her in the bathroom. Evelyn protecting appearances over humanity. The post-nuptial trap. The manipulation. The financial schemes. The years stolen from her. And worst of all, Isaac still believed she would never fight back. No. Lula whispered finally. Mara nodded once. Understanding. That night, Lula sat alone in the bedroom after Isaac fell asleep beside her. She looked at his face carefully in the darkness. It was terrifying how normal he looked. How human, how familiar. 7 years together, vacations, inside jokes, birthdays, losses, comfort, routine, and underneath all of it, lies. Isaac shifted slightly in his sleep and reached unconsciously toward her side of the bed. Habit, possession, need. Lula stared at his hand resting near hers and felt something unexpected rise inside her. Not hatred, grief, because once upon a time she truly loved this man. Deeply. Enough to build her life around him, enough to disappear for him, enough to excuse things that slowly destroyed her. But love without respect became erosion, and somewhere along the way, Isaac stopped loving her as a person and started loving her as infrastructure. The next morning, the anniversary party invitations finalized. The rooftop venue overlooked the Chicago skyline. Luxury sponsors, private press photography, corporate attendees. A performance disguised the celebration. Isaac kissed Lula's forehead before leaving for work. After this party, he said confidently, everything changes. Lula looked at him quietly. The tragic thing was, he actually believed that sentence meant success. He had no idea it meant destruction. Later that afternoon, Diane arrived at Lula's house privately, through the back entrance. The women sat together in the sunroom, reviewing final preparations. Evidence copies, legal filings, digital backups, timeline coordination. Every detail mattered now.
Diane closed the final folder carefully. Once this begins, she said calmly, there's no undoing it. Lula looked out the window at the falling snow. For the first time in months, she felt strangely calm. Not because she wasn't afraid, but because fear no longer controlled the direction of her life. She had spent 2 years watching Isaac build a trap around her. Now he was about to discover she had quietly built one around him too. Her phone buzzed softly beside her, a text from Mara.
Everything is ready. Once you start, there's no going back. Lula stared at the message for several long seconds, then slowly typed back, good. The anniversary party glittered like a lie. From the rooftop ballroom, the Chicago skyline looked endless beneath winter darkness. Gold lights reflected across the river. Snow drifted softly, beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows, while champagne flowed through the room in endless crystal glasses. Beautiful people laughed beneath chandeliers. A string quartet played near the terrace. And everywhere Lula Ferguson looked, she saw performance. Marriage as branding, love as currency, success dressed in tuxedos. Isaac Whitmore stood at the center of it all, smiling like a man already celebrating victory. The board members had arrived, investors too. Several local business magazines sent photographers. Everything Isaac wanted was finally within reach. Power, promotion, prestige. And beside him stood the wife who made him look trustworthy. Lula wore the Whitmore diamond necklace Evelyn had insisted on. Heavy stones pressed cold against her collarbone. It felt less like jewelry and more like chains. "You okay, Isaac?" asked softly as guests mingled around them. Lula looked at him carefully, at the expensive tuxedo, the confident posture, the man who had lied to her face for 2 years while asking for her loyalty. "I'm fine," she said calmly. Isaac smiled, relieved, still so certain of her. That certainty was about to ruin him. Across the ballroom, Brooke Langley stood beside several executives in a dark satin gown. Elegant, polished, confident. She caught Lula's eye briefly, then glanced toward Isaac, possession hidden beneath sophistication. Lula almost pitied her now. Almost? Because Brooke still thought this story ended with her winning Isaac. She had no idea Isaac was about to lose everything instead. As the evening progressed, guests congratulated the couple constantly. "You two are marriage goals. 7 years and still glowing. Isaac, you're a lucky man." Each compliment felt surreal, like watching strangers admire a painting while standing inside the fire that created it. At one point, an older investor's wife touched Lula's arm gently. "You must be proud of him." Lula smiled softly. "I used to be." The woman laughed, assuming it was a joke. Isaac didn't hear it. If he had, maybe things would have unfolded differently. Or maybe not. Men like Isaac rarely listened carefully until consequences arrived. Around 9 o'clock, the event coordinator approached. "Mr. Whitmore, we're ready for the anniversary toast?" Isaac straightened immediately. "Showtime." He squeezed Lula's hand warmly before guiding her toward the stage. Applause filled the ballroom as they stepped beneath the lights together. Photographers moved closer. Board members smiled approvingly. Everything was perfect, exactly the way Isaac designed it. He lifted his champagne glass confidently. "When I look around this room tonight," he began smoothly, "I see friendship, partnership, and people who've supported me throughout the most important years of my life." His public voice always sounded warmer, more sincere, That was part of what made him dangerous. He knew exactly how to perform goodness. Isaac turned toward Lula with practiced affection. And none of this would exist without my wife. Applause erupted immediately. Lula stood beside him motionless. Isaac continued. Lula has stood by me through every challenge, every late night, every ambition. He smiled emotionally. She believed in me before anyone else did. The crowd melted. Several women looked emotional. Brooke remained still near the back of the room, but Lula noticed her jaw tighten slightly. Isaac placed a hand gently against Lula's back. She's the kindest person I know. The irony almost made Lula laugh out loud. Kindness. How many times had Isaac weaponized that kindness against her?
How many times had he mistaken gentleness for weakness? Isaac lifted his glass higher. To loyalty, to marriage, and to the woman who made my life worth building. Thunderous applause exploded across the ballroom. Isaac smiled triumphantly. Then he handed Lula the microphone. Her turn. Her cue to complete the performance. For a moment, the room blurred slightly around her. Not from fear, from clarity. This was it. The exact moment her whole life ended in it.
Lula looked out across the ballroom slowly. Board members, investors, friends. Evelyn sitting rigid near the front. Brooke standing frozen near the back. And Isaac beside her smiling with complete confidence, still unaware. Lula lifted the microphone carefully. Thank you all for being here tonight. Her voice sounded calm, steady. The room quieted immediately. Lula smiled faintly. For a long time, I believed love meant protecting someone at all costs. Isaac's smile faltered almost invisibly, tiny. But there, Lula continued softly. I believed loyalty meant silence. The ballroom grew quieter. You see, she looked directly at Isaac now. For 2 years, I let people mistake my silence for ignorance. The air changed instantly, not loudly, but sharply. Like the pressure in the room shifted. Isaac's hand stiffened slightly against her back. Lula, he murmured quietly beside her. Warning. Too late. Lula turned toward the audience again. I found out about my husband's affair during the 3rd month. Complete silence crashed through the ballroom. Someone dropped a glass somewhere near the back. Isaac went pale instantly. Brooke stopped breathing. Evelyn's expression turned to stone. Isaac leaned closer urgently, still smiling for appearances. What are you doing? Lula ignored him. For 2 years, she continued calmly, I watched people praise a man who came home smelling like another woman's perfume. Shock spread visibly now. Whispers. Confused stares. Isaac's voice dropped lower. Stop. But Lula had spent too many years stopping herself already. No, she said quietly into the microphone. I think I'm finally done stopping. Isaac reached for her arm harder this time. Not violent. Controlled. Desperate. Lula, enough. She looked directly at him. And, for the first time in years, he looked afraid. Real fear. Not irritation, not annoyance, fear. The realization steadied her completely. Lula turned back toward the crowd. I stayed silent because I needed time to understand how deep the lies went. Isaac's public mask was beginning to crack now. Whatever you think is happening, he interrupted loudly, forcing a laugh. This clearly isn't the place. Oh, I know exactly what's happening, Lula replied calmly. Then she reached into her clutch purse. The ballroom froze. Lula connected her phone to the audio system beside the stage. Isaac moved immediately. Lula. But the recording had already started. Brooke's voice echoed clearly across the ballroom. Isaac said your marriage has been emotionally over for a long time. The room went completely still. Then another line. He said he stayed because leaving would complicate finances. Brooke's face drained of color. Isaac lunged toward the sound system. Too late. The final sentence played clearly through the speakers. Isaac told me you're too soft to fight for yourself anyway. Silence. Absolute silence. Lula slowly disconnected the phone. No screaming. No dramatic collapse. Just truth, sitting naked in the center of the room. Isaac looked at Brooke in horror. Brooke looked like she might faint. Board members stared at Isaac with expressions shifting rapidly from confusion to calculation. Investors whispered urgently. Photographers stopped pretending not to listen. Evelyn looked furious enough to shatter glass. And somehow, through all of it, Lula felt calm. Isaac stepped closer, voice shaking now. Lula, please, you're emotional. Emotional. Even now. Even here. Lula smiled faintly. No, Isaac. Her voice remained terrifyingly soft. I was emotional 2 years ago. She reached slowly toward her neck and unclasped the Whitmore diamond necklace. The room watched every movement. Lula placed the necklace carefully onto the table beside the champagne glasses. I was your wife, she said quietly. But somewhere along the way, you turned me into your cover story. Isaac looked around the room desperately now. Damage assessment, reputation collapse, career calculation, panic. Diane Caldwell quietly exited through a side door. So did Mara. The evidence packages were already moving toward legal teams, corporate investigators, and the board. This wasn't revenge born from rage. This was strategy born from survival. Isaac lowered his voice dangerously. You have no idea what you're doing. Lula met his gaze steadily. No, she said softly. You just never imagined I would. Then she handed him an envelope. Divorce papers. Isaac stared down at them in stunned silence. And for the first time since Lula discovered the affair, the powerful Isaac Whitmore looked completely powerless. The silence after destruction was always the loudest. For several seconds, after Lula handed Isaac the divorce papers, nobody in the ballroom moved. No music, no polite laughter, no clinking champagne glasses. Only shock. Pure, suffocating shock. Isaac stared at the envelope in his hands as if it might somehow disappear if he blinked hard enough. Then his survival instincts finally activated. This is absurd, he snapped suddenly, forcing a laugh that sounded painfully fake. Lula is upset and clearly misunderstanding. Don't, Lula said quietly. One word. Soft. Controlled. But it stopped him instantly. Because Isaac had heard fear in her voice for years. Never certainty. Not like this. Several board members exchanged uncomfortable looks near the front tables. One investor quietly pulled out his phone. Brooke stood completely frozen near the back of the ballroom, her face drained white beneath the chandeliers. And Evelyn Whitmore looked furious enough to collapse under the weight of her own rage. Isaac stepped closer to Lula, lowering his voice sharply. You're embarrassing yourself. Lula met his gaze calmly. No, Isaac, she replied softly. I'm embarrassing you. That sentence landed like a slap. The room shifted again. People were no longer looking at Lula with pity. They were looking at Isaac with suspicion. And he knew it. Isaac grabbed Lula's elbow tightly enough to hurt. Come with me, he hissed. The smile remained frozen on his face for the audience. Performance until the bitter end. Lula allowed him to guide her toward a private hallway outside the ballroom. The second the doors shut behind them, Isaac exploded. What the hell is wrong with you? The rage in his voice echoed against marble walls. Lula stood perfectly still. There it is, she said quietly. Isaac blinked. What? The real you? His chest rose sharply with anger. You blindsided me in front of investors, board members, my family. Your mistress was there too, Lula interrupted calmly. Would you like me to apologize to her specifically? Isaac stared at her like he no longer recognized the woman standing in front of him. Maybe he didn't. Because the Lula who once cried quietly in bathrooms to avoid upsetting him was gone now. You're acting insane, he snapped. No, Lula replied softly. I was insane when I kept protecting you. Isaac ran a hand through his hair aggressively. You think this makes you look strong? No, she said. I think surviving you made me strong. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence felt enormous. Then Isaac's expression shifted suddenly. The rage softened. His voice lowered. Manipulation changing shape in real time. Lula, he said carefully. We can fix this. There it was. The pivot. Because narcissistic men rarely apologize when they hurt you. They apologize when consequences arrive. You made your point, Isaac continued. Fine. You're angry, I understand that. Angry. Not betrayed. Not devastated. Just emotional again. Isaac stepped closer carefully. I never wanted to hurt you. Lula almost laughed. Not because it was funny. Because it was unbelievable. You built an entire second life while asking for my inheritance, she whispered. And you still think this is about hurt feelings? Isaac's jaw tightened immediately. The inheritance. That part frightened him most. Not the affair, the money. Always the money. You're twisting things, he said sharply. Lula replied. I finally stopped untwisting them for you. The hallway door suddenly opened behind them. Evelyn? Of course. She looked between them furiously. What have you done? She demanded at Lula. Not Isaac. Never Isaac. Lula felt something inside her go cold permanently. Evelyn marched closer in heels, sharp enough to sound like weapons against the marble floor. There are board members in that room, she hissed. Business partners. Investors. Lula held her gaze calmly. And your son brought his mistress. Evelyn's face hardened instantly. You should have handled this privately. The sentence hit harder than expected. Not because Lula was surprised. Because she finally understood the full depth of Evelyn's loyalty. Not to morality, to image. Lula looked at her quietly. Did you know? Evelyn hesitated. Tiny. Brief. Enough. Isaac stepped in quickly. Mom. No. Lula interrupted softly. I want to hear her answer. Evelyn lifted her chin slightly. I knew there were difficulties in your marriage. Cowardly. Careful. Calculated. You knew he was cheating. Evelyn's silence confirmed everything. Lula felt grief move through her chest slowly. Not for Isaac anymore. For herself. For all the years she spent trying to become lovable enough for people who only valued usefulness. You protected him, Lula whispered. Evelyn's eyes sharpened. I protected my family. The cruelty of that sentence settled heavily between them. Because Lula had been family too. Or at least she thought she was. Isaac stepped forward again, frustration boiling over.
This conversation is pointless. No, Lula said quietly. This conversation is honest. Isaac laughed bitterly. You think honesty matters now? Lula stared at him. It mattered when you lied. For the first time that night, Isaac looked genuinely cornered. Not socially, financially, legally, professionally. And Lula could see his mind working rapidly now. Damage control, narrative management, risk assessment. What exactly do you want? He asked finally. The question surprised her, because for years nobody had asked that, not really. What do you want, Lula? Not what keeps peace, not what helps Isaac, not what protects appearances. Her voice stayed calm. My freedom. Isaac's face darkened immediately. You're overreacting. There it was again. That word. As though betrayal, manipulation, financial deception, and humiliation were minor marital inconveniences. Lula shook her head slowly.
No, I just stopped minimizing what you've done. Inside the ballroom, muffled voices rose louder now. People talking, speculating. The collapse had already started. Isaac sensed it too. His breathing changed, panic creeping beneath the anger. Then his phone buzzed. He checked it instantly. And Lula watched the exact moment fear hit him fully. What Evelyn demanded. Isaac didn't answer immediately. Another message appeared. Then another. His face lost color. Lula understood before he even spoke. The board. Diane and Mara had moved faster than he expected. Finally, Isaac looked up slowly. What did you send them? Lula smiled faintly. Only the truth. Isaac stepped toward her suddenly. Not violent, but close enough to intimidate. You have no idea what you've started. Lula didn't move. That's interesting, she said softly. Because for 2 years, I thought the same thing about you. Isaac's voice dropped lower now. Dangerous. If my career collapses because of this, your career collapses because of your choices. Lula interrupted calmly. Evelyn grabbed Isaac's arm suddenly. We need to contain this. Contain. Like Lula was a scandal instead of a human being. Isaac looked between both women, then finally asked the question that revealed everything. How much proof do you actually have? Not why did you stay silent so long? Not how badly did I hurt you? Not can we save this proof, evidence, exposure? Lula suddenly felt exhausted. Not weak, just done. I documented everything she said quietly. Isaac went completely still. And for the first time since she met him, Lula watched Isaac Whitmore realize he was no longer the smartest person in the room. Back inside the ballroom, guests had started leaving discreetly. Investors avoided eye contact. Executives whispered in clusters. Brooke was nowhere to be seen. Coward Lula thought distantly. Or maybe Survivor. Sometimes those looked similar. Isaac rubbed a trembling hand across his jaw. Then his voice changed again. Another tactic. Softer now. Desperate. Lula, please. The word sounded foreign, coming from him. Let's go home and talk. Home. As if home still existed. As if marriage still existed. As if betrayal could be folded neatly back into silence. Lula looked at him one final time. At the man who truly believed she would stay small forever. Then calmly said, I already did my talking, Isaac. And this time she walked away first. The courtroom was quieter than Lula expected. No dramatic shouting, no shocking movie-style confessions. Just fluorescent lights, polished wood, and the cold exhaustion of people watching a marriage die under legal language. Outside, snow fell across downtown Chicago in soft gray sheets. Inside, Isaac Whitmore sat at the opposite end of the courtroom, looking like a man slowly realizing charm had limits. For weeks after the anniversary party, chaos consumed everything. Corporate investigations, board inquiries, whispers in business circles, articles carefully hinting at executive misconduct concerns. Isaac tried controlling the narrative at first. Of course he did. He told people Lula had become emotionally unstable, that she misinterpreted friendships, that the pressure of infertility discussions had affected her mental health. The cruelty of it no longer surprised her. Men like Isaac always rewrote women into villains once obedience ended. But Lula had prepared too carefully. Every lie Isaac told now collided against documentation, dates, transactions, audio recordings, financial trails, screenshots, emails, proof. Diane Caldwell had built the case meticulously, not emotionally, strategically. And that terrified Isaac more than anger ever could. Lula sat beside Diane now, in a cream-colored suit, hands folded neatly in her lap. Calm, controlled, no longer hiding. Across the room, Isaac looked exhausted for the first time since she met him. The arrogance remained, but thinner now, cracked. A man trying desperately to hold power through force of personality, while everything underneath collapsed. His attorney, Richard Levin, stood first. Smooth voice, expensive watch, the kind of lawyer wealthy men hired when they needed someone to sanitize ugly behavior. Your Honor, Richard began confidently. This is ultimately a marriage suffering from emotional miscommunication, not malicious intent. Lula almost laughed. Emotional miscommunication. What a polished phrase for betrayal, manipulation, and fraud. Richard continued. My client acknowledges inappropriate personal conduct. However, Mrs. Whitmore has intentionally orchestrated public humiliation in ways clearly designed to damage Mr. Whitmore professionally. There it was. The strategy. Paint Lula as vindictive, emotional, unstable. The angry wife. Richard turned toward the judge carefully. We believe many of these claims are exaggerated reactions stemming from marital dissatisfaction rather than genuine financial misconduct. Diane didn't react immediately. She simply stood slowly once Richard finished. Calm women frightened people like Isaac more than screaming women ever did. Diane adjusted her glasses. Your Honor, she said evenly, we are not here discussing marital disappointment. We are discussing deliberate deception, financial coercion, misuse of marital assets, and documented manipulation. Then she began presenting evidence, one piece at a time. Like building a wall, Isaac could not climb over. Expense reports linked to Brooke Langley. Corporate reimbursements used for private luxury expenses. The hidden apartment connected through shell company structures. Hotel records. Jewelry purchases. And finally, the post-nuptial agreement. Diane placed copies before the court carefully. This document, she explained, was presented to Mrs. Ferguson while Mr. Whitmore concealed an ongoing affair and simultaneously sought access to her protected inheritance. The judge's expression sharpened slightly. Isaac shifted visibly beside his attorney. Diane continued calmly. Mr. Whitmore encouraged emotional dependency while privately preparing financial mechanisms that would benefit him significantly in the event of marital dissolution. Lula watched Isaac's jaw tighten harder with every sentence. Not guilt, exposure. That was always the thing men like Isaac feared most. Not hurting people, being seen clearly. Mara Jensen testified next. Sharp, professional, unshakable. She explained reimbursement irregularities in precise detail. False categorization of luxury expenses. Business accounts funding personal relationships. Approval chains involving Brooke Langley. The courtroom stayed silent except for the occasional scratching of pens against legal pads. Because numbers didn't cry. Numbers didn't exaggerate. Numbers simply existed. Richard attempted damage control quickly. Miss Jensen, isn't it possible these accounting inconsistencies were simple oversight? Mara smiled faintly. No. Richard stiffened slightly.
You sound very certain, I am. She slid several highlighted reports toward him. Repeated luxury expenditures categorized identically over 22 months is not oversight. It's concealment. Isaac stared at the table. For the first time, Lula noticed sweat along his collar. Interesting. Then came the moment that changed everything. Discovery evidence. Emails. Diane handed copies directly to the judge. These communications were recovered during financial disclosure review.
Isaac looked up sharply. Real fear this time. Richard quickly scanned the pages. His face changed instantly. Lula knew before anyone spoke. They found the worst ones. Diane's voice remained steady. In these emails, Mr. Whitmore discusses delaying divorce proceedings until Mrs. Ferguson's inheritance could be integrated into business expansion accounts. The courtroom went completely still. Then Diane read aloud. Once Lula transfers the funds, everything becomes easier to structure. After that, I'll handle the divorce cleanly. Isaac closed his eyes briefly. Not remorse, calculation failing. The judge's expression darkened immediately. Richard attempted interruption. Context matters here. Context. Diane replied sharply for the first time. The context is that my client was emotionally manipulated while her husband conducted an affair and attempted to secure access to protected assets under false pretenses. Lula felt something strange then. Not triumph, relief. Because finally someone else was saying the truth out loud. No minimizing, no excuses, no polished corporate language softening cruelty into misunderstanding, just truth. Isaac finally spoke. His voice sounded rougher than usual. I never intended to steal from Lula. Diane turned toward him immediately. Then why conceal the affair while pressuring her to sign financial agreements? Isaac hesitated. Fatal mistake. The silence answered louder than words. Richard stepped in quickly. My client acknowledges mistakes in judgment. Mistakes, Diane interrupted quietly. She reached for another document. Would you classify purchasing an engagement ring for another woman using disguised business expenses as a mistake too? The courtroom froze. Lula's heartbeat stopped for a second. Engagement ring. Brooke. So Diane had already included the newer evidence. Isaac looked genuinely shaken now. Richard whispered urgently beside him. The judge looked irritated. Diane continued calmly. We have reason to believe Mr. Whitmore intended to continue misleading both parties while restructuring financial protections around anticipated divorce proceedings. Isaac finally snapped. This is ridiculous. The anger burst out too fast. Too loud. There was never a plan to take Lula's money. Diane looked directly at him. Then why did you tell your mistress you would leave your wife once financial complications were resolved? Isaac's silence answered again. Every silence became confession now. Lula sat motionless through all of it. Months ago, this would have destroyed her emotionally. Now she mostly felt tired. Tired of lies. Tired of manipulation. Tired of watching powerful people treat empathy like weakness. By the afternoon recess, word had already spread through legal and business circles. Executives avoided Isaac in courthouse hallways. 2 board members quietly exited without speaking to him. His reputation was collapsing in real time. Not because Lula screamed, because evidence existed. As proceedings resumed, the final blow arrived unexpectedly. Brooke Langley entered the courtroom. The tension changed instantly. Brooke looked exhausted. Gone was the polished confidence from the gala. She wore black minimal makeup and the expression of someone realizing she had attached herself to a sinking ship. Isaac stared at her in disbelief. He clearly hadn't expected cooperation. Interesting. Brooke took the stand carefully. Richard looked horrified. Diane remained perfectly calm, Miss Langley. Diane began. Were you aware Mr. Whitmore remained legally committed to Mrs. Ferguson throughout your relationship? Brooke swallowed. Yes. Isaac closed his eyes briefly. Brooke continued quietly. He told me they were emotionally separated. Emotionally separated. Another polished lie.
But you understood they were still publicly functioning as husband and wife, yes? Diane nodded once. And were you involved in approving expense submissions connected to your relationship with Mr. Whitmore? Brooke hesitated. Then quietly, yes. Isaac looked at her sharply. Betrayed now, himself. The irony was almost unbearable. Brooke's voice shook slightly. He told me it was temporary, that everything would be fixed after the expansion. There it was again. The expansion, always tied back to Lula's inheritance. Lula looked at Brooke carefully. For the first time, she didn't see a rival. She saw another person manipulated by the same selfish man. Not innocent, but not fully powerful either. When court adjourned for the day, Isaac remained seated long after everyone else stood. Defeated, cornered, exposed. Lula gathered her papers quietly. As she exited the courtroom, her phone buzzed. Unknown number. She opened the message slowly. It was from Brooke. There's one more thing you need to know. Meet me before he buries it. Lula stared at the screen while snow continued falling outside the courthouse windows. And suddenly, she realized Isaac Whitmore's secrets still weren't finished destroying lives. Lula almost ignored Brooke's message. For several minutes, she simply sat inside her car outside the courthouse while snow collected against the windshield in soft white layers. There's one more thing you need to know. The sentence unsettled her. Because after everything already revealed, Lula couldn't imagine what else remained hidden. And yet men like Isaac rarely destroyed only one life at a time. 3 hours later, Lula walked into the hotel cafe Brooke had selected. Public. Quiet. Safe. Smart choice. Brooke sat alone near the back corner beneath dim amber lighting, hands wrapped tightly around a coffee cup that had clearly gone cold long ago. She looked different now. Not glamorous, not polished, not victorious. Just tired. Deeply tired. When Lula approached the table, Brooke stood awkwardly. Thank you for coming. Lula remained standing for a moment before finally sitting across from her. You said, there's something I need to know. Brooke nodded slowly. For several seconds, neither woman spoke. The silence felt strange. Months ago, Lula imagined screaming at this woman, throwing drinks, destroying something. But now that they sat face to face without Isaac between them, the emotion felt more complicated. Pain remained. Anger too. But beneath it sat clarity. Brooke finally spoke first. I'm sorry. Lula held her gaze calmly. No, she said quietly. You're sorry now. The truth landed hard enough to make Brooke flinch. Good, because Lula was finished comforting people who participated in her humiliation. Brooke looked down at her hands. I know I don't deserve forgiveness. No, Lula agreed softly. You don't. The honesty shocked both of them. Because women were trained to soften truth, to make cruelty easier for others to digest. Lula no longer felt interested in that performance. Brooke swallowed hard. He told me your marriage was basically over. Lula gave a faint, humorless smile. And you believed him at first. The answer was honest enough to hurt. Brooke stared toward the cafe windows. He said you stayed together because of appearances, money, family expectations. Isaac's favorite strategy, rewriting reality differently for every audience. He told me you didn't love him anymore. Lula looked at her quietly, and that made it okay. Brooke's eyes filled instantly with shame. No. At least there was honesty now. Small, late, but real. Brooke rubbed trembling fingers against the coffee cup. I knew he was still married.
I knew what I was doing. Finally. Truth without excuses. Lula felt something inside her loosen slightly. Not forgiveness, just exhaustion ending. Brooke laughed bitterly under her breath. The worst part is, I actually thought I was different. Different. Special. Chosen. Lula understood that feeling painfully well. Isaac had built entire worlds around making women feel uniquely understood while draining them for emotional supply. Brooke looked up slowly. He made me feel important. Lula's chest tightened unexpectedly, because she remembered that version of Isaac too. The charming one, the attentive one, the man who once looked at her like she mattered most in the room. People rarely fell for manipulators because they were stupid. They fell because manipulators studied loneliness carefully. Brooke wiped beneath her eyes quickly. He told me you were cold. Lula almost laughed. Cold. After years of sacrificing everything for him, Isaac needed every woman around him to play a role, Lula said quietly. The supportive wife, the exciting mistress, the proud mother, the admiring co-workers. Brooke looked stunned for a second, because Lula understood him now. Completely. And what role did he play? Brooke whispered. Lula answered without hesitation. Whatever got him what he wanted. The cafe fell silent again. Outside, snow drifted past the windows in soft grey waves. Brooke reached slowly into her purse. There's more. She slid a thick envelope across the table. Lula's stomach tightened instantly. What is this insurance? Lula opened the envelope carefully. Inside were printed emails, expense reports, screenshots, and photographs. One photo made her breath catch instantly. An engagement ring. Elegant. Expensive. Beautiful. Lula stared at it for several long seconds, then slowly looked up. Brooke nodded weakly. He bought it 3 months ago. 3 months. While still pressuring Lula to sign the post-nuptial agreement. While discussing children, while asking for inheritance access. The cruelty was almost incomprehensible now. He was going to propose after the board review, Brooke whispered. Lula looked back down at the ring receipt. Payment routing through disguised business reimbursements. Of course. Everything with Isaac became financial manipulation eventually. Brooke's voice shook slightly. He said once the expansion stabilized, he'd leave quietly and start over. Start over. Like Lula's life was simply collateral damage in his reinvention story. Lula felt pain move through her chest slowly, but not the sharp, devastating pain from before. This was different now. Cleaner somehow. The final death of illusion. Brooke took a shaky breath. There's something else. Lula looked up. Brooke's expression collapsed completely. He was preparing to blame me. Interesting. Not surprising, but interesting. Brooke handed over additional screenshots. Messages from Isaac discussing protecting himself if reimbursement investigations intensified. One sentence stood out immediately. If things go bad, they'll believe she handled most of the reporting anyway. Lula stared at the screen in disbelief. Brooke laughed bitterly through tears. I risked everything for him. Yes, she had. And Isaac would have sacrificed her instantly to save himself. That was the thing about selfish men. They eventually consumed everyone around them, including the people who helped them cheat. Brooke looked broken now. Not heartbreak broken, identity broken. The kind that happened when someone realized they built their future around a fantasy. I know you hate me, Brooke whispered. Lula considered the question honestly, then answered carefully. No. Brooke blinked in surprise. I don't trust you.
Lula continued. "And I don't excuse what you did." Brooke lowered her eyes. "But I think Isaac taught both of us to mistake being chosen for being valued." Silence filled the table, because that was the real tragedy. Neither woman had truly been loved. They had been used differently. Brooke wiped her face again. "I don't know what happens to me now." Lula understood that fear too well. The terrifying emptiness after illusion collapsed. But unlike Brooke, Lula had already begun rebuilding herself. "You survive it," Lula said quietly. Brooke looked up slowly. How Lula thought about therapy, about returning to hospital work, about remembering who she was outside Isaac's approval, about finally choosing herself, one honest day at a time. For the first time since sitting down, Brooke cried openly, not dramatically, just quietly, humanly. Lula watched her carefully. Months ago, seeing Brooke cry would have satisfied something ugly inside her. Now it mostly made her sad, because women destroying each other was often just collateral damage created by selfish men at the center. Eventually, Lula gathered the documents carefully back into the envelope. "This helps my case." Brooke nodded weakly. "I know." Lula stood slowly. Brooke looked panicked suddenly. "Wait." Lula paused. Brooke's voice cracked. "Did he ever really love either of us?" The question hung painfully between them. Lula thought about it for a long moment, then answered honestly. "I think Isaac loved being needed." Brooke closed her eyes, because deep down, she already knew. Lula turned toward the exit, but before leaving, she looked back one final time. "You should get your own lawyer." Brooke blinked. "You're not angry?" Lula gave a faint, exhausted smile. "Oh, I was angry, past tense." That mattered. "But anger isn't where I live anymore." Then she walked away. Outside, the snow had finally stopped falling. Chicago glittered beneath cold winter light. Lula sat inside her car for several minutes, staring at the envelope beside her. The engagement ring receipt remained visible near the top. A proposal funded through deception. Love disguised as theft. She almost laughed at the absurdity. Then slowly, quietly, Lula whispered the sentence that finally freed something inside her. "You were never going to stop hurting people until someone stopped protecting you, and this time, no one was protecting Isaac Whitmore anymore." By spring, Chicago no longer looked like the city where Lula Ferguson's marriage ended. The snow was gone. The trees along Lakeshore Drive had started blooming again. People filled outdoor cafes, boats moved across the water. Life continued with rude, beautiful indifference. And somehow, so did Lula. The divorce proceedings stretched across months, but the emotional ending had already happened the night of the anniversary party. Everything afterward was paperwork, settlements, disclosures, consequences. Isaac Whitmore's career collapsed slowly at first. Then all at once, the board suspended him pending investigation. Several clients quietly withdrew partnerships. Industry gossip spread faster than official statements ever could. Corporate Chicago loved success stories, but it loved public downfall even more. Articles began appearing online, questions about expense misuse, executive ethics concerns, improper financial reporting. Nothing criminal yet, but enough. Enough to poison reputation. Enough to make rooms colder when Isaac entered them. Lula heard updates indirectly through Mara and Diane. She never searched his name herself anymore. That part mattered, because healing began the moment she stopped organizing her emotional world around Isaac's existence. Evelyn Whitmore disappeared from social events almost entirely. Several longtime family friends distanced themselves quietly after the scandal. Not because they suddenly cared about morality, because scandal threatened proximity to power. And power was all people like Evelyn truly worshipped. As for Brooke Langley, she resigned from the company within 2 months. The investigation spared her from full destruction after she cooperated, but her professional reputation suffered badly. Lula thought about her sometimes. Not obsessively, just occasionally.
Two women pulled into the orbit of the same selfish man and damaged in different ways. But Lula no longer carried the desire to compete with her. Competition required emotional investment, and Lula was finally investing in herself instead. The divorce finalized on a warm afternoon in May. No dramatic courtroom scene, no final screaming match. Just signatures, documents, silence. Diane squeezed Lula's hand afterward. It's done. Done.
Such a small word for the death of an entire life. Yet when Lula stepped outside the courthouse, she didn't cry. She inhaled deeply instead. The air smelled like rain and lake water. Freedom had no dramatic soundtrack. It sounded like breathing normally again. A week later, Lula moved into her new apartment overlooking Lake Michigan. Not a mansion, not a Whitmore estate. Just sunlight, soft colors, quiet mornings, and space that belonged entirely to her.
The first night there, she sat cross-legged on the living room floor, surrounded by unopened boxes, eating takeout pasta straight from the container. And for the first time in years, the silence felt peaceful. Not lonely. Peaceful. No tension humming beneath conversations. No waiting for footsteps. No wondering who Isaac was texting. No shrinking herself to avoid conflict. Just peace. Lula slowly rebuilt her life from there. She bought furniture she actually liked instead of what looked impressive to guests. She played music while cooking, left books open on tables without worrying someone would mock her interests. She slept diagonally across the bed. Tiny freedoms. But after years of emotional control, tiny freedoms felt revolutionary. The biggest change came through work. Rebecca Sloan officially offered Lula leadership over the hospital's new pediatric wing fundraising campaign. At first, Lula almost declined. The old insecurity still whispered sometimes. You're too emotional, too soft, too dependent. Years with Isaac had trained those thoughts deeply. But therapy taught her something important. A cruel voice repeated, long enough eventually disguises itself as your own. So Lula accepted. The first fundraising strategy meeting terrified her. As she walked into the conference room, carrying presentation notes, old fear tightened inside her chest. What if she failed? What if Isaac had been right about her? Then the meeting began. And within 20 minutes, Lula remembered exactly who she used to be. Sharp, compassionate, intelligent, persuasive. She spoke about donor relationships with calm confidence, proposed outreach ideas, reorganized campaign structures. By the end of the meeting, executives leaned toward her attentively. Rebecca smiled proudly from across the table. And Lula realized something heartbreaking. Isaac hadn't destroyed her confidence overnight. He eroded it slowly, so she would never notice how small she became. That realization hurt. But it also freed her. Because what was slowly broken could also be rebuilt slowly. Weeks passed, then months. And little by little, Lula Ferguson stopped introducing herself emotionally as someone recovering from betrayal. She became someone living again. One evening after work, she walked along the lakefront beneath golden sunset light when her phone buzzed. Unknown number. Lula almost ignored it. Then curiosity won. The message was short. I know I don't deserve a response, but please let me explain everything properly. Isaac Lula stared at the screen for a long moment before locking the phone again. No panic, no racing heartbeat. Interesting. Once upon a time, a message from Isaac could ruin her entire day emotionally. Now it barely disturbed the peace she built. Still, the messages continued over the following weeks. Emails, voicemails, long apologies.
Isaac cycled through every version of regret. I was selfish. I didn't realize what I had. You were the best thing in my life. I miss you. I still love you. At first, Lula ignored everything. Then one rainy night, curiosity made her open one of the emails. It stretched nearly 4 pages. Isaac described losing clients, losing respect, losing his future. But as Lula read carefully, she noticed something revealing. Even his apologies centered himself. His losses, his suffering, his loneliness. Very little about her pain. Very little about what he actually did to her emotionally. The realization no longer devastated her. It clarified everything. Isaac didn't miss Lula as a person. He missed stability, admiration, ease. The version of himself reflected back through her love. Lula closed the email quietly, then deleted it. Not dramatically, not angrily, simply done. By late summer, the Pediatric Wing campaign became one of the hospital's most successful fundraising initiatives in years. Local media praised Lula's leadership repeatedly. Donors trusted her instantly. Parents loved her warmth. Children remembered her name. One little girl undergoing chemotherapy handed Lula a handmade bracelet during a hospital visit. For good luck, she whispered shyly. Lula nearly cried, not from sadness, from perspective. For so long, her emotional world revolved around a man incapable of valuing her correctly. Meanwhile, the parts of her that truly mattered had been waiting patiently all along. Compassion, intelligence, strength, purpose. Those things survived Isaac. Maybe they always would have. In September, the hospital hosted its first major gala for the pediatric expansion campaign. A real celebration this time. Not performance, not deception. Hope, healing, meaning. Lula stood in front of the mirror inside her apartment, adjusting a midnight blue gown before leaving. She looked different now. Not because of the dress, because peace changes people physically. Her eyes looked lighter, softer, stronger. As her car pulled up outside the gala venue downtown, Lula smiled faintly at the glowing lights reflecting across the river. Then she saw him. Isaac Whitmore stood outside the entrance holding flowers. For one suspended second time, folded backward painfully. Because he still looked familiar. Still looked like the man she once loved. But familiarity and safety were not the same thing anymore. Isaac stepped forward immediately when he saw her. His face looked older now, tired, the confidence stripped away. "Lula," he said quietly. She remained still. The flowers trembled slightly in his hands. "Please," he whispered. "Just 5 minutes." And for the first time since leaving him, Lula realized she no longer feared this conversation at all. Isaac Whitmore looked nothing like the man Lula once feared losing. The expensive suit remained, the polished haircut, the careful posture. But the energy was gone. No effortless confidence, no magnetic arrogance, no certainty that the world would bend itself around him. He stood outside the gala entrance, holding white roses, like a man arriving too late to his own life. "Lula," he said again, quietly. Behind her, warm golden light spilled from the ballroom doors while guests laughed inside. Life waited for her in that room. Purpose, peace, people who valued her. And standing in front of her was the man who once convinced her she would be nothing without him. Funny how reality worked. Lula looked at the flowers briefly before meeting his eyes. "You shouldn't be here." Isaac swallowed hard. "I know. At least there was honesty now. Small miracle,
Rain misted softly across downtown Chicago, catching silver beneath the streetlights. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Isaac exhaled shakily. I destroyed everything. The sentence hung between them. Lula expected satisfaction hearing it. Closure. Victory. Instead, she mostly felt sadness. Not because she wanted him back, because once upon a time she truly believed this man would protect her heart. And now he stood in front of her emotionally bankrupt. Isaac extended the flowers awkwardly. I don't expect forgiveness. Lula didn't take them. Good. Because some apologies arrived too late to deserve softness. Isaac lowered the bouquet slowly. I know I don't have the right to ask for anything, he continued quietly. But I needed you to hear this from me. Lula waited. The old version of her would have rushed to comfort him already. The new version understood silence had power too. Isaac looked exhausted.
Dark circles beneath his eyes. Tension carved into his face. Consequences aged people quickly. I lied to myself about who I was. He admitted. No. He knew who he was. He simply assumed he'd never have to face it. You didn't just lie to yourself, Lula said softly. Isaac nodded weakly. I know? Do you, Lula, wasn't sure? Because truly understanding the damage you caused required empathy. And empathy had always been Isaac's weakest skill. Cars moved slowly through wet streets nearby. Inside the gala, music drifted faintly through the doors. Isaac stared at her carefully. You look happy. The sentence sounded almost disoriented. Like happiness on her confused him now that he no longer controlled it. Lula answered honestly. I am. Something inside Isaac visibly broke at that. Not because he wanted her happy. Because he realized she achieved it without him. Men, like Isaac, often assumed women existed in emotional orbit around them forever. The idea that Lula rebuilt herself completely shattered his ego more than divorce ever did. I read about the hospital campaign, he said, quietly. Everyone's talking about you. Lula gave a faint nod. It matters to me? I know. Isaac smiled sadly. I should have understood that years ago. Yes, he should have. But he only noticed her value once other people started celebrating it publicly. Isaac looked down briefly before speaking again. I kept thinking you'd eventually calm down and come home. The honesty stunned her slightly. Not because it was surprising, because it confirmed everything. You thought this was temporary, Lula said quietly. I thought... He stopped. I thought you loved me enough to stay. There it was, the core of everything. Isaac mistook love for permission. Permission to betray. Permission to manipulate. Permission to take without consequence. Lula looked at him steadily. I did love you enough to stay, she whispered. That was the problem. Isaac closed his eyes briefly. Rain tapped softly against the sidewalk around them. I never meant for things to go this far. Lula almost laughed. People always said that after destruction, as if devastation accidentally assembled itself. You cheated for 2 years, she said calmly. You tried to manipulate me into signing away financial protections. You lied to everyone around you. Isaac's voice cracked slightly. I know. No, Lula replied softly. You know now because you lost. That sentence hit him harder than anything else she'd said. Because it was true. If Isaac had succeeded, if she stayed quiet, if she signed the agreement, he never would have stopped. Isaac rubbed trembling fingers across his jaw. I ruined the best thing in my life. Again. Still about him. His loss. His regret. Lula noticed it instantly. And strangely, that realization brought peace instead of anger. Because she finally understood something clearly. Isaac's emotional range ended wherever accountability began. He could feel shame, loss, panic, regret for consequences. But genuine understanding of her pain, that part remained shallow. And once Lula saw that fully, she stopped waiting for the apology she deserved. Isaac looked at her desperately. "I loved you." Lula studied him carefully, then answered with painful honesty. "I think you loved how safe I made your life feel." Isaac flinched like she slapped him. Good. Because truth should sting sometimes. For years, Lula confused being needed with being cherished. There was a difference. A massive one. Isaac stepped closer slowly. "I would do anything to fix this." The old Lula might have cried hearing that. This Lula only felt tired. "You had years to fix it," she said quietly. Silence. Isaac's eyes filled slightly. Not performative this time. Real. Because reality finally reached him. Lula Ferguson was truly gone. Not dead, not broken. Just unavailable to him now. And nothing terrified selfish people more than losing access permanently. Isaac looked toward the gala entrance behind her. "You really moved on?" Lula thought about her apartment overlooking the lake, therapy sessions, hospital meetings, peaceful mornings. The sound of her own laughter returning slowly. She smiled faintly. "No," she said, softly. "I moved back toward myself." That sentence seemed to hollow him out completely. For several long seconds, neither moved. Then Lula glanced toward the ballroom doors. "I should go inside." Panic flickered across Isaac's face instantly. "Wait." She paused politely. Isaac swallowed hard. Was any of it real? The question almost broke her heart. Not because she doubted herself, because she remembered the girl she used to be. The woman who loved him honestly before survival replaced innocence. Lula answered gently. "For me, all of it." Isaac looked devastated, as he should, because losing someone who loved you genuinely after treating them carelessly was its own punishment. Lula took one final step backward toward the entrance. Then Isaac asked the question quietly. "Do you hate me?" The rain softened around them. Chicago glowed gold beyond the streetlights. Lula thought about everything. The betrayal, the humiliation, the affair, the manipulation, the years she disappeared inside his shadow. And surprisingly, the answer came easily. No. Isaac looked stunned. Lula smiled sadly. "I think hating you would keep me emotionally tied to you." She shook her head softly. "And I'm finally free." The words settled over both of them quietly. Final. True. Isaac stared at her like he was seeing her clearly for the first time. Not as a wife, not as stability, not as emotional shelter, as a person, too late. Lula reached for the ballroom door slowly. Warm light spilled across her face. Then she looked back one final time. "I hope someday you become someone who doesn't destroy people just because they love you." Isaac's expression collapsed completely. And for the first time since she met him, no part of Lula wanted to save him from himself. She entered the gala without looking back again. Inside, music swelled warmly through the ballroom. Rebecca waved excitedly from across the room. Doctors, donors, and families filled the space with genuine joy. No performance, no lies, no pretending, just purpose. As Lula moved through the crowd, people greeted her with admiration, earned honestly. And somewhere behind her, outside beneath the rain and city lights, Isaac Whitmore finally experienced the one thing he spent years making other people feel: abandonment. But unlike Lula, he had earned it.
After everything, Lula Ferguson survived. She learned one painful truth. Some people will gladly drink from your kindness while convincing you that you are asking for too much in return. For years, Lula believed love meant sacrifice. She believed loyalty meant patience. She believed if she gave enough, forgave enough, supported enough, eventually, she would be loved the same way back. But real love does not require you to disappear to keep someone comfortable. Real love does not punish kindness. And real partnership never depends on one person shrinking so the other can feel powerful. The hardest lesson wasn't discovering Isaac's affair. It was discovering how long she had abandoned herself, trying to save a relationship built on manipulation. Healing didn't happen overnight. There was no magical moment where all the pain disappeared. Healing came quietly, through boundaries, through therapy, through rebuilding confidence, one honest decision at a time, through learning that being alone is far less painful than being emotionally abandoned beside someone who claims to love you. And maybe that's the real message of Lula's story. A soft heart is not weakness. Kind women are not foolish. And surviving betrayal does not make you broken. Sometimes the strongest thing a woman can do is stop protecting the people who keep hurting her.
Sometimes peace begins the moment you choose yourself. And sometimes the people who took your love for granted only recognize your value after they lose access to you forever. If this story moved you, tell me in the comments. What moment made you realize Lula finally took her power back? And if you've ever had to rebuild yourself after betrayal, heartbreak, or emotional manipulation, share your story too. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and stay for more emotional stories about healing, self-worth, karma, and finding your strength again.